Think about your evening for a second. Phone, Netflix, maybe a podcast. Now, imagine none of that exists. No screens, no internet, nothing. Welcome to Victorian England. And I promise you, it was anything but boring. Because on any given night you'd find factory workers screaming at Skittles games in smoky pubs, music halls packed, with couples dancing to jokes too dirty to print, and aristocrats gambling away fortunes in candlelit ballrooms. Same era, wildly different worlds. And tonight, we're walking through all of it. Hey, quick thing before we get into this. If these stories help you sleep, a like or subscribe would be amazing. Also, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. Last week, I had someone from Glasgow comment at 2 in the morning and someone from Boston at the exact same time. Honestly, blew my mind how many of you are out there at the same moment, all just trying to fall asleep. Anyway, let's do this. Alright, so we're heading back to Victorian London tonight. But first, get comfortable. I mean it. Adjust those pillows. Pull up that blanket because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. Trust me on this one. Your eyes open to darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of your bedroom right now. Something different, something thicker. The air is heavy with coal smoke and something else, something sour. Your back aches from the thin, straw mattress beneath you. And as your brain slowly catches up to your body, you realize where you are. London, 1875, and you are absolutely exhausted. Your name is Billy Harrison. You're 24 years old, and for the past 14 hours you've been hauling cargo at the East India docks, crates of tea from Ceylon, barrels of sugar from the Caribbean. Your shoulders feel like someone's been taking a hammer to them, and your hands are so callous they barely register pain anymore. The room you're waking up in is about the size of a large closet. You share it with your younger brother Samuel, who's still snoring on the other side of the narrow space. Through the thin walls you can hear the family next door arguing about money. Someone on the floor above is coughing. The whole building seems to breathe with the sounds of 100 different lives crammed into spaces never meant to hold them. This is a lodging house in Whitechapel. 6p a night gets you a bed. Well, a bed is a generous word. It's more like a wooden frame with some straw stuffed into a sack. Not exactly the cozy setup you've got right now, is it? But here's the thing. You're not thinking about the aching muscles or the cramped room or the fact that you'll be back at those docks in about 8 hours, doing the whole thing over again. You're thinking about tonight because tonight is Saturday. And Saturday night in Victorian London means one thing, the pub. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. A pub? That's it. That's the big Victorian entertainment. But hold on, because Victorian pubs were nothing like what you're imagining. These weren't quiet establishments where people sat around sipping drinks and discussing the weather. These were absolute chaos engines. Loud, crowded, smoke-filled rooms where the entire working class of London came to forget about their miserable lives for a few precious hours. And thanks to something called the Beer House Act of 1830, there were thousands of them. Basically, the government decided that the best way to combat the gin epidemic that was devastating the poor was to make it incredibly easy to sell beer instead. Anyone with 2 guineas could open a beer house just like that. No real licensing, no fancy requirements, just slap up a sign and start pouring. The result? By 1850, there were nearly 50,000 beerists in England. 50,000, that's one. For roughly every 60 people. In some neighborhoods, there was a pub on every corner. Sometimes 2, sometimes 3 on the same street. So, when Billy Harrison drags himself out of that straw mattress as the evening bells ring across London, splashing some cold water on his face and pulling on his least dirty shirt, he's not walking far to find entertainment. 3 streets over, that's all. The Anchor and Crown sits wedged between a pawn shop and a boarded-up chandler's store. It's not much to look at from the outside. Grimy windows, a faded sign that's been repainted so many times the Anchor looks more like a blob with some lines sticking out. The door doesn't quite hang straight, so you have to shove it with your shoulder to get in. But inside is a different world. The first thing that hits you is the noise. It's like walking into a wall of sound. Dozens of voices all talking at once, layered over each other in a kind of human symphony of complaints and jokes and arguments and laughter. Somewhere in the back, someone's playing a fiddle, not well but enthusiastically, which, when you think about it, is what Victorian entertainment was really all about. The second thing is the smell. Beer, obviously, but also piped tobacco and unwashed bodies and sawdust on the floor that's probably been there for months, absorbing whatever gets spilled on it. Not exactly pleasant, but after a why, your nose just gives up and accepts it. Billy pushes through the crowd toward the bar. He knows almost everyone here. There's George from the docks already, 3 pints in and telling the same story about the time he accidentally dropped a crate of silk on the foreman's foot. There's old Ned, who claims he fought with Wellington at Waterloo and might actually be telling the truth given how ancient he looks. There's Martha behind the bar, built like a brick wall and twice as immovable, who been running this place since before Billy was born. The usual love. Martha doesn't wait for an answer. She's already pouring. The beer is warm and flat and probably watered down. It costs 2 pence, which is about as much as Billy wants to think about right now. That's a decent chunk of his weekly wage going into this glass. But you know what? After 14 hours of hauling cargo, after sleeping on straw, after sharing a closet with your brother and listening to your neighbors fight through paper-thin walls, sometimes you just need a drink. Besides, he's not just here for the beer. In the back room of the Anchor and Crown, something magical is happening. Well, maybe magical is a strong word, but for the working class of Victorian London, it's pretty close. It's called Skittles. Picture this: a wooden alley, maybe 30 feet long, set up in what used to be a storage room. At one end, 9 wooden pins arranged in a diamond pattern. At the other end, a bunch of dock workers and factory hands rolling wooden balls and taking the whole thing incredibly seriously. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds pretty tame. And okay, fair. It's not exactly extreme sports. But here's the thing about Victorian pub games. They weren't just games. They were battlegrounds, proving grounds, places where men who had absolutely no control over their lives could finally compete at something, could finally win at something, could finally feel like they mattered, and there was money involved. "Penny a point?" someone shouts as Billy pushes his way into the back room. "Harrison, you in?" "Of course he's in." Billy grabs one of the wooden balls. It's heavy and smooth, worn down by thousands of hands before his. The trick to Skittles isn't power, it's aim. It's reading the slight imperfections in the wooden alley, understanding how the ball will curve based on where you release it. There's actually a lot of skill involved, way more than you'd expect. He takes a breath, lines up his shot, and lets it go. The ball rolls down the alley with a satisfying rumble, hits the front pin dead center. The pins scatter, with a crack that brings a cheer from the crowd behind him. Strike. Okay, so they don't call it a strike in Skittles. The terminology is different, but you get the idea. Billy steps back, grinning. For just a moment, he's not a dock worker making barely enough to survive. He's a champion, a competitor, someone worth watching. And that's the thing about Victorian entertainment. That's what I really want you to understand. These weren't people sitting around being stern and proper and boring. These were people desperately, hungrily seeking out joy wherever they could find it. Whether that was in a game of Skittles or a song around the bar or just standing next to a fire and talking with friends about absolutely nothing important. The Skittles game goes on for about an hour. Billy wins some, loses some, ends up about 3 pints ahead, which feels like a victory even though he spent at least 6p on beer while playing Victorian math. But the real entertainment is just getting started. Around 9, the fiddle player in the corner puts down his instrument. A ripple of anticipation moves through the pub. People start pushing toward the back room, clearing away the Skittles, equipment, arranging themselves in a rough semicircle around a small raised platform that's really just some crates pushed together. This is what they call a free and easy. The name comes from the informal nature of the thing. No tickets, no formal program. Just whoever feels like getting up and performing. It's Victorian open mic night, basically. Except instead of struggling comedians and poets, you get factory workers belting out popular songs and dock hands, doing comic monologues about their bosses. A man Billy vaguely recognizes climbs onto the platform. He's a coal heaver from the sound of his voice, thick with the accent of the East End. He clears his throat dramatically, raises his hands for quiet, and begins to sing. The song is called Champagne Charlie. It's a massive hit right now, one of those tunes that everyone knows that's been played in every music hall from here to Manchester. It's about a man who spends all his money on champagne, living the high life while everyone else struggles. The joke, of course, is that Charlie is terrible with money and will probably end up poor like the rest of them. It's a song that makes fun of the rich while secretly admiring them. Very Victorian. But here's the thing about Victorian singing. It wasn't passive. This wasn't like putting on headphones and listening to something. This was participatory, active. The coal heaver sings the verses, sure, but when it comes to the chorus, everyone joins in. Champagne Charlie is my name. Champagne Charlie is my name. Good for any game at night, my boys. Good for any game at night, my boys. The whole pub is singing. Billy is singing. The old man next to him who can barely stand is singing. Martha behind the bar is singing while still pouring drinks because she's just that good at her job. The walls are practically shaking, with the sound of 50 voices all belting out the same tune. Slightly off key, slightly out of sync, but absolutely committed to the moment. This is what entertainment meant for the Victorian working class. Not sitting quietly and watching, not consuming passively, but participating. Being part of something, feeling the vibration of other voices mixing with your own, feeling connected to the crowd around you in a way that transcended all the usual divisions of daily life. The song ends with a massive chair. Someone else takes the stage, a woman, this time one of the factory girls from down the street, her face still slightly grey with textile dust. She performs a comic monologue about a housewife trying to deal with a landlord, and she's actually pretty good. The crowd roars at her impersonations, at the way she captures the pompous voice of authority figures they all hate. More performers follow, more songs, more jokes. Some of them are terrible. Some of them don't even make it through their first verse before they're booed off the platform. But that's part of it too. The audience is part of the show. If you're good, they'll love you. If you're bad, they'll let you know. There's an honesty to it that you don't really find in more polished forms of entertainment. Around 11, Billy finally stumbles out of the Anchor and Crown. His head is buzzing pleasantly. His pockets are slightly lighter than when he came in, but not catastrophically so. And for the first time since he woke up that morning, he doesn't feel like a dock worker. He feels like a person. The streets outside are still alive with activity. This is what always surprises people about Victorian London, the idea that everyone went to bed at sundown, that the city was quiet and dark after nightfall, complete myth. Especially on a Saturday night, the streets were packed with people, street vendors selling hot pies and roasted chestnuts, children playing games in the gaslight, couples walking arm in arm, looking for darker corners, groups of men moving from pub to pub, singing as they go. Billy passes a small crowd gathered around a man with a barrel organ. The music is tiny and repetitive, but the man has a monkey, an actual monkey, dressed in a tiny red jacket doing little tricks and collecting coins in a cup. The children are absolutely losing their minds with delight. A little further on, there's a woman with a cart selling whelks and oysters. Billy doesn't have eno money left for oysters, but he buys a twist of whelks for a halfpenny. They're chewy and slightly gritty with sand, but there's something satisfying about eating them as you walk, dropping the shells in the gutter behind you. This is Saturday night in Victorian London, not the London of grand ballrooms and elegant dinner parties, not the London of lords and ladies in fancy dress balls. This is the other London, the real London, The London of working people finding whatever scraps of joy they can grab before Monday morning comes around again. And here's the thing that strikes Billy as he walks home through the maze of narrow streets, past the lodging houses and the pawn shops and the churches that seem to appear on every other corner. Tomorrow is Sunday, and Sunday means something different. For most of the week, Billy and people like him are invisible. They work, they survive. They don't really matter to the people who run things. But on Sunday, at least in theory, everyone is equal before God. Rich and poor alike sit in the same churches, sing the same hymns, listen to the same sermons about how wealth doesn't matter and the last shall be first and all that. Of course, the pews are segregated by class, and the rich have their own private boxes, and nobody really believes that the factory owner and his workers are actually equal. But still, there's something about Sunday that feels different. A pause in the relentless machinery of survival. After church, if the weather is good, there might be a walk in one of the new public parks that have started appearing in the industrial cities. Victoria Park opened just 20 years ago, and on a Sunday afternoon, it's packed with working families, children playing on the grass, couples courting under the watchful eyes of their mothers, old men feeding the ducks. It's not fancy, it's not exclusive. It's just people being enjoying a rare moment of leisure. But right now, walking home through the Saturday night streets, Billy isn't thinking about Sunday. He's thinking about his bed, his terrible, uncomfortable straw mattress that suddenly sounds like the most wonderful thing in the world. His muscles are finally relaxing. The beer is doing its work. The songs are still echoing in his head. And maybe that's the most honest thing I can tell you about Victorian entertainment. It wasn't about escaping reality. Not really, because you couldn't escape reality in Victorian London. You couldn't pretend you weren't poor, weren't tired, weren't one bad week away from the workhouse. The reality was too present, too heavy, too constant to ignore. What entertainment offered was something different, a transformation of reality. Taking the same cramped pub, the same worn-out songs, the same familiar faces, and making them mean something else for a few hours, making the drudgery feel less drudging, making the exhaustion feel almost worth it. Billy reaches his lodging house, climbs the creaking stairs, pushes open the door to his tiny room, where Samuel is already asleep and snoring. He doesn't bother undressing, just kicks off his boots and falls onto the mattress. The straw crinkles beneath him. Through the walls, the neighbors have stopped fighting. Somewhere in the distance, he can hear the last echoes of Saturday night fading into Sunday morning, and Billy Harrison, dock worker, exhausted and slightly drunk and happier than he's been all week, closes his eyes. Tomorrow there will be church. Monday there will be the docks again. Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday will blur together in an endless repetition of hauling and carrying and surviving. But next Saturday, the Anchor and Crown will be waiting. The Skittles pins will be set up. Someone will sing Champagne Charlie. And for a few hours, Billy will be something other than just another pair of hands at the docks. He'll be part of something not unlike you right now, lying in your bed, listening to this story. Part of something too, even if it's just the strange connection between a voice and an ear across time and distance. The difference, of course, is that your bed is probably a lot more comfortable than Billy's straw mattress. Your room is probably warmer. Your pillow is definitely softer. These are the little miracles of modern life that we forget to appreciate. The fact that you can lie down at night without your back aching from the straw, without cold smoke in your lungs, without the sound of 100 other lives pressing in from every direction. But the need for entertainment, for connection, for those moments of joy that make the rest of it bearable, that hasn't changed at all. Meanwhile, somewhere else in London that same Saturday night, a different kind of entertainment is happening. A different crowd is gathering for a different kind of show. But that's a story for a little bit later, because right now, in the darkness of his lodging house room, Billy Harrison is already dreaming. And in his dreams, as in his waking life, the songs of the free and easy are still playing. Now, while Billy Harrison was drinking beer and singing songs in Whitechapel. Something very different was happening about 2 miles west. A 14-year-old boy named Charlie Finch was standing outside a converted shopfront on Drury Lane, clutching a penny in his sweaty palm, waiting for the doors to open. Charlie worked at a textile mill, had, since he was 9, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, feeding cotton into machines that could take your fingers off if you weren't paying attention. He'd seen it happen twice. The second time the boy was only 8, but tonight was Saturday. Tonight he had a whole penny to spend, and he was going to spend it at the gaff. Now, if you've never heard of a penny gaff, you're not alone. They've been pretty much forgotten by history, but in the 1850s and 60s, they were everywhere. London had dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Nobody really kept count because technically most of them weren't supposed to exist. See, regular theaters required licenses, proper permits from the government, inspections, rules about what you could and couldn't perform. All very official and expensive. Penny gaffs had none of that. What they had was a room. Sometimes it was the back of a pub, sometimes an empty shop, sometimes just a warehouse with some benches shoved in and a platform at one end. The one Charlie was waiting outside used to be a butcher shop. You could still smell it if you breathed deep enough, which you definitely shouldn't. The doors opened at 7. Charlie pushed his way in with about 40 other kids, most of them around his age, all of them factory workers or street sellers or errand boys. The smell hit first, sweat and tobacco, and that lingering meat odor from the building's previous life. Then the heat, bodies packed tight, in a space meant for maybe 20 people. But Charlie didn't care about any of that because up on that rickety platform lit by a few sputtering gas lamps, magic was about to happen. Tonight's show was the life and crimes of Jack Sheppard. If you don't know Jack Sheppard, let me fill you in. He was a thief who lived back in the 1720s. Pretty unremarkable criminal. Honestly, what made him famous was his escapes. The guy broke out of prison 4 times. 4, including once from Newgate, which was supposed to be escape-proof. He became this massive folk hero. Songs written about him, plays performed about him, the whole thing. And now, over 100 red years later, factory kids in London were still paying pennies to watch actors pretend to be him. The performance started with a bang. Literally. Someone backstage dropped a metal sheet, making a crash that was supposed to be thunder. Half the audience jumped, the other half laughed at them. Then Jack Sheppard himself appeared, or rather, a guy in a ratty coat who was supposed to be Jack Sheppard. He struck a pose hand, on hip, chin raised, looking heroic despite the fact that his costume was clearly made from old curtains. "I am Jack Sheppard," he announced, "and no prison can hold me." The crowd went nuts. Here's what you need to understand about penny gaff audiences. They weren't quiet. They weren't polite. They didn't sit there silently appreciating the art. These kids had been working all week. They'd been yelled at by foremen and smacked by overseers and told to shut up and keep their heads down for 72 hours straight. Now they were free and they were loud. "Go on, Jack. Show them what for." That's it. That's it. Every time Jack did something clever, cheers. Every time the villain appeared, boos so loud you could barely hear the dialogue. When the love interest came on stage, wolf whistles and rude suggestions that would have made a sailor uncomfortable. And the actors just rolled with it. Had to. The whole point of a penny gaff was the energy, the chaos, the feeling of being part of something instead of just watching it. Charlie was pressed up, against the stage, close enough to see the sweat on Jack Sheppard's forehead, close enough to smell the cheap gin on his breath. The actor wasn't great, forgot his lines twice, made up stuff that didn't quite make sense, but it didn't matter. The story was moving, things were happening, and for one glorious hour, Charlie wasn't a factory boy anymore. He was in the audience of the greatest show in London. The plot, such as it was, followed Jack through his crimes and his escapes. Each prison break got more elaborate, more impossible, more ridiculous. By the end, Jack was basically superhuman, slipping out of chains like they were made of paper, climbing walls that shouldn't be climbable, outwitting guards who were portrayed as complete idiots. The message wasn't subtle. Authority figures are stupid. The little guy can win. Rules are made to be broken. You can see why the upper classes hated these shows. They really, really hated them. One city missionary called penny gaffs dangerous dens of amusement and claimed they were breeding grounds for criminals. Another reformer said they were corrupting the youth and teaching them that crime pays. The police raided them constantly, shutting them down, arresting the performers, trying to stamp them out entirely. But you know what? The gaffs just kept popping back, up. Close one down on Drury Lane, another opens on Whitechapel Road. Arrest the guy playing Jack Shepherd, and 3 more actors are ready to take his place because the demand was there. Kids, like Charlie, needed this, needed somewhere to go, something to feel, some escape from the endless grey monotony of factory life. The show ended with Jack's eventual capture and execution. Even penny gaffs couldn't change history that much, but the actor playing Jack delivered his final speech with such melodrama, such over-the-top emotion that half the audience was crying, including Charlie. He'd deny it later, but his eyes were definitely wet. Then Jack dropped through a trapdoor in the stage representing the gallows, and the crowd erupted in the strangest mix of cheers and sobs you've ever heard. Show over. Penny well spent. Charlie stumbled out into the street with the rest of the audience, his head still buzzing with the story. The night was just getting started. Because here's the thing about Victorian London, after dark, the entertainment didn't stop when you left a building. The whole street was a show. Right outside the gaff, a man was swallowing a sword, an actual sword. Charlie stopped to watch, equal parts, fascinated and horrified as the blade disappeared down the guy's throat inch by inch. When it came back out, clean and gleaming, the small crowd that had gathered tossed coins into a hat. A little further down, 2 acrobats were performing on a worn-out mat, tumbling, flipping, building human pyramids. One of them couldn't have been older than Charlie, probably younger. His timing was perfect, though. Every flip landed exactly right. Every catch came at the last possible second. The danger was real, or at least it looked real, which was the whole point. Street performers in Victorian London were their own economy. Some of them made decent money. Most of them barely scraped by. The good ones could pull in more than a factory worker. The bad ones starved. Simple as that. Charlie watched a fire next, a woman which surprised him. She lit a torch, tilted her head back, and lowered the flame into her mouth. Once, twice, 3 times. Each time Charlie expected her to burst into flames. Each time she didn't. How did that work? He had no idea. Still don't, honestly. Something about how you hold your breath and the flame needs oxygen. But watching it happen in the flickering gaslight of a London street, it looked like pure magic. Then he heard it. A sound that every Victorian child knew. A sound that meant chaos and laughter and violence that was just fake enough to be funny. The Punch and Judy show. A small crowd had gathered around a striped booth set up on the corner. The booth was tattered, patched in multiple places, clearly held together by stubbornness and string. But from inside came the unmistakable, squeaky voice of Mr. Punch. That's the way to do it. For those who don't know, Punch and Judy was basically Victorian cartoon violence in puppet form. Mr. Punch was the main character. He was horrible, absolutely horrible. He beat his wife. He threw his baby out the window. He murdered anyone who annoyed him, including police officers and sometimes the devil himself. And kids loved him. They loved him because he was chaos. Pure, unfiltered, consequence-free chaos. In a world where children were expected to be seen and not heard, where stepping out of line meant getting beaten, where authority was absolute and unquestionable, Mr. Punch did whatever he wanted. He hit people with sticks. He lied constantly. He never got punished. He always won. That's the way to do it. Charlie watched the whole show, laughing until his stomach hurt. Punch murdered a string of victims, a doctor, a policeman, his own wife, Judy, though she somehow came back for more abuse later. Each murder was accompanied by the same squeaky catchphrase, the same whack of a wooden stick, the same howls of delight from the audience. Was it appropriate? By modern standards, absolutely not. By Victorian standards, also probably not. Reformers hated Punch and Judy shows almost as much as they hated penny gaffes, too violent, too anarchic, teaching children that violence is funny. But the shows kept going, had been going since the 1600s, would keep going for another century and more, because sometimes you need to watch a puppet hit another puppet with a stick. Sometimes that's exactly the kind of entertainment that makes sense. The Punch Man finished his show, passed around a hat, and started packing up his booth. Charlie had no more coins to give, but he'd gotten his entertainment for free just by standing in the crowd. That was the thing about street entertainment. The hat got passed, sure, but nobody forced you to pay. If you were broke, you could still watch, still laugh, still feel like you were part of something. Charlie wandered on. The streets were getting darker. Now the gas lamps fewer and farther between. But there was still more to see. A man with a peep show box had set up near a gin shop. For a halfpenny you could look through a hole and see painted scenes illuminated from behind. Charlie didn't have a halfpenny, but he watched other people react. Their faces lit up as they peered through the holes, seeing views of foreign cities, famous battles, exotic animals they'd never encounter in real life. It was basically Victorian virtual reality, a tiny window into a world beyond the grey streets and smoky factories. Nearby, an Italian organ grinder was cranking out tunes, while a monkey in a red jacket danced and collected coins. Charlie had seen this act before. Same man, same monkey, same songs, but he still stopped to watch because the monkey had learned a new trick. Now it tipped its little cap when someone gave it money, adorable and slightly disturbing in equal measure. And then there were the other kids, because Charlie wasn't the only 14-year-old on the streets tonight. Far from it. All around him, children were doing what children have always done, playing. A group of boys were racing wooden hoops down the street, steering them with sticks, crashing into each other, and laughing when they fell. Girls had chalked a hopscotch grid on the pavement, and were taking turns jumping through it, their skirts bunched up in their hands. Tag marbles, some game that involved throwing a ball against a wall and catching it in increasingly complicated ways. No toys, really nothing bought from a shop. Just whatever they could find, make or imagine. Sticks became swords, pebbles became currency, an empty street became a racetrack, a battlefield, a kingdom. Victorian children worked hard, harder than you can probably imagine from the comfort of your bed right now. They worked in factories and mines and fields. They worked as chimneous weeps, climbing up into spaces so small an adult couldn't fit. They worked until their bodies gave out, but when they got a chance to play, they played just as hard. Charlie joined a game of tag for a while, running through the narrow alleys, dodging around carts and pedestrians, his lungs burning and his legs aching, but his spirit absolutely soaring. He got tagged. He tagged someone else. He got tagged again. At some point, the game transformed into something else, some combination of tag and hide and seek that nobody had formally agreed on, but everyone seemed to understand. The rules didn't matter. The running mattered, the laughing mattered, the being young and free and alive for just a few hours before Monday came around again. Eventually, Charlie slowed down. His body was reminding him that he'd been up since 5 that morning, that he'd worked a full shift at the mill, that he wasn't actually made of endless energy, no matter how much it felt like it right now. He found a quiet corner and sat down back against a brick wall, still warm from the day's sun. The street sounds washed over him. Laughter from a nearby pub. Someone singing off-key but enthusiastic. A dog barking at nothing. A baby crying in an upstairs window. This was his world, loud and chaotic and dirty and wonderful. Tomorrow there would be church. His mom would make him wear his good shirt, the one that was getting too small but was still the nicest thing he owned. They'd sit in the back pews and listen to the vicar talk about heaven and hell and proper behavior. Then Monday back to the mill, back to the machines that hummed and clattered and occasionally took fingers, back to the foreman's shouting and the endless grey hours. But right now, sitting in the dark with Jack Shepherd's story still fresh in his mind, with the echoes of Punch's squeaky voice still ringing in his ears, with his legs aching from running and his face sore from smiling, Charlie Finch felt something close to happy. Not the same kind of comfortable happiness you might be feeling right now, sinking into your pillow with the weight of your blanket pressing down nice and even. Charlie's happiness was sharper, more desperate, the kind of joy you grab with both hands because you know it won't last, but joy nonetheless. The same basic human need that Billy Harrison satisfied at the pub, the same thing that rich folks satisfied at their fancy parties, just wearing different clothes and spending different money to get to the same place. A moment of escape, a breath of freedom, a reminder that life isn't only work and sleep and survival. Charlie eventually made his way home, a cramped room in a cramped building, shared with his parents and 3 siblings. He was asleep within minutes of lying down, dreaming of prison, escapes and puppet shows and sword swallowers on gaslit streets. And somewhere across the city, in neighborhoods he'd never visit and houses he'd never enter, a very different kind of Saturday night was wrapping up. But we'll get to that soon. Enough. For now, let's stay with the working people a little longer, because there's one form of entertainment we haven't talked about yet. The one that would change everything. The one that took all the chaos of the street shows and all the energy of the penny gaffs and turned it into something bigger, louder and wilder than anyone had ever seen. The music hall. Billy Harrison had been to plenty of pubs, sang in plenty of back rooms, thought he knew what entertainment looked like. Then his mate George took him to the Canterbury. The Canterbury Music Hall sat on Westminster Bridge Road, and from the outside it didn't look like much, just another building on a busy street. But inside was something Billy had never seen before. The place was massive, bigger than any pub, bigger than any church he'd ever been in. A proper auditorium with a raised stage at one end, gaslit chandeliers hanging from an ornate ceiling, and row after row of tables where hundreds of people sat, drinking, eating, and making noise. "Bloody hell," Billy said when they walked in. George just grinned. "Told you. This was 1876. The Canterbury had been open for about 20 years by then, and it had transformed from a simple tavern with some singers into this cathedral of entertainment. The owner, a guy named Charles Morton, had figured out something important. People didn't just want to drink, they wanted a show, and they'd pay good money for both at once. Billy and George found seats near the middle. A waiter appeared almost immediately, which was strange enough. Billy wasn't used to being waited on. They ordered pints and some oysters because apparently that's what you did at places like this. The crowd was different here too. Sure, there were working men like Billy, plenty of them, but there were also clerks in their decent suits, shopkeepers with their wives, even some women who'd come in, groups without any men at all. Everyone mixed together, drinking from the same bar, watching the same stage. Up front, sitting at a small table right below the stage, was the chairman. Every music hall had one. His job was to introduce the acts, keep the crowd in line, and generally run the show. This one was a round man with impressive whiskers and a voice that could cut through any amount of noise. He banged a gavel on his table. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Canterbury." Cheers from the crowd. Billy joined in without thinking. "We have a magnificent evening of entertainment prepared for you. Comedy, drama, song, and perhaps a few things that might make the ladies blush. More cheers. Some laughter." A woman near Billy shouted something back, that deaf Knightley should have made her blush, but she seemed proud of it. The chairman continued his introduction, listing off the acts for the night. Billy couldn't catch all the names, but then the first performer walked on stage, and it didn't matter anymore. She was a comedian, a woman comedian, which was unusual enough. She did a routine about trying to find a husband, all the terrible men she'd met, all the ridiculous things they'd said to impress her. The crowd was howling within 30 seconds. "He told me he owned property in Mayfair," she said, timing perfect. Turned out he meant the doorstep he slept on. Billy laughed so hard he nearly spit out his beer. That was the thing about music hall comedy. It wasn't clever wordplay for educated types. It was real jokes about real life. landlords and bosses and terrible food and worse lodgings. The comedian on stage knew exactly what her audience dealt with every day, and she made fun of all of it. After her came a singer, male this time, dressed in a ridiculous costume that made him look like some kind of aristocratic fool. He sang a song about being too fancy for his own good, tripping over his walking stick and mispronouncing words while the piano player kept up a jaunty tune. The crowd sang along to the chorus. Billy didn't know the words yet, but he picked them up fast. That was how these songs worked. Simple, catchy, designed to stick in your head. By the third chorus, everyone in the hall was belting it out, together. Then came acrobats, then a magic act, then another comedian. This, one doing impressions of politicians that had the audience roaring. Each act lasted maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Quick enough that you never got bored. Varied enough that there was something for everyone. And through it all the drinks kept flowing. Waiters moved through the crowd constantly, delivering pints and spirits and cups of tea for those who won. Ted them. Food, too. Oysters, obviously. Pies, bread and cheese, pickled fish. You could make a whole meal of it if you had the money. The Canterbury wasn't cheap exactly. A ticket cost 6 pence, which was twice what Charlie had paid for his penny gaff. Plus you were expected to buy drinks all night. By the time Billy left, he'd probably spend more than a day's wages, but God was worth it. Around 9, the chairman banged his gavel again. Ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've been waiting for, the Queen of the Canterbury, the one, the only, Miss Bessie Bellwood. The place erupted, people standing on chairs, stomping their feet, whistling and cheering before the woman had even appeared. Then she walked on stage, and Billy understood why. Bessie Bellwood wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. She was short, round-faced, plainly dressed, but the moment she opened her mouth, something happened. The whole room just stopped, focused, waited. She sang a song called What Cheeria. It was about a woman from the slums who'd made good, who'd climbed her way up from nothing, who refused to forget where she came from. The melody was simple. The lyrics were clever. But it was her voice that made it magic, strong, clear, completely unafraid. When she hit the chorus, the whole audience joined in. Not politely, not quietly, full-throated, arm-waving, table-pounding singing that shook the chandeliers. Billy sang too. He didn't know the words, not all of them, but he knew the feeling, the pride, the defiance, the sense that people like him, people from the docks and the factories and the cramped lodging houses, they mattered too. They had their own music, their own stars, their own damn cathedral. Bessie did 3 more songs. Each one got the same response. By the end, Billy's throat was raw from singing, and his hands hurt from clapping. After her came more acts, a ballet performance. Manse that was more comedy than grace. A strong man who lifted audience members over his head. A singer who did sentimental ballads that made half the room cry into their beers. The show went on past midnight. Billy lost track of time completely. Lost track of how much he'd spent too, which he'd regret in the morning. But right now, in this moment, none of that mattered. At some point, George nudged him and pointed toward the gallery upstairs. See that lot up there? Billy looked. The upper level had boxes like a proper theater, private seating for people who wanted to watch without mixing with the common folk below. Some of them were clearly wealthy, top hats and fancy dresses, watching the same show, drinking the same drinks, but from a safe distance. Toofs, Billy said. Yeah, but they're here, aren't they? Same as us, watching Bessie Bellwood, laughing at the same jokes. George had a point. The music hall was one of the few places in Victorian London where the classes actually shared space. They weren't exactly equal, obviously. The rich got better seats and didn't have to smell the crowd below, but they were breathing the same air, hearing the same songs, experiencing the same thing. It wouldn't last forever. Already by 1876, some of the newer music halls were getting fancier, cleaner, more respectable, trying to attract middle-class audiences by toning down the rude jokes and the suggestive songs. But places like the Canterbury held on to their roots. The comedy stayed sharp. The songs stayed cheeky. The crowd stayed loud and drunk and wonderful. Billy stumbled out sometime after 1 in the morning. His ears were ringing. His legs were unsteady. His heart was full. Same time next month, George asked. Make it next week, Billy said. They shook hands and went their separate ways. Billy walked home through the empty streets, still humming that chorus from Bessie Bell. Leeward's song. What cheer, what cheer. The city looked different at this hour, quieter, the gaslights flickering in. The fog, the occasional figure hurrying past, head down, purpose unknown. A cat, slinking through the shadows, a drunk singing to himself on a corner. Billy should have felt tired, should have felt the exhaustion of a long week at the docks and a long night at the hall. But instead, he felt alive, more alive than he'd felt in months. That's what entertainment does. It takes you out of yourself for a while, makes you forget the ache in your back and the worry about rent and the grinding sameness of daily survival. For a few hours at the Canterbury, Billy Harrison wasn't a dock worker. He was part of something, part of a crowd, part of a community that existed only in that room, only on that night, but was absolutely real while it lasted. Not so different from you right now actually lying there in your bed, listening to this story, letting someone else's words carry you away from whatever your day held. The technology, changed the basic human need, didn't made it back to his lodging house as the sky was starting to lighten a few hours of sleep before Sunday morning. His landlord would be furious if he slept through church again, but that was a problem for later. For now he collapsed onto his straw mattress, pulled the thin blanket over himself, and let the music from the Canterbury play on in his dreams. While Billy slept, the music halls kept thriving. By the 1880s, there were hundreds of them across Britain. London alone had maybe 300 or 400, depending on how you counted. They ranged from fancy palaces of variety entertainment to grimy little rooms that barely qualified. The performers became genuine celebrities. Their names appeared in newspapers, their songs sold as sheet music by the thousands. Children in factories sang the same choruses that dukes hum, aired in their carriages. And the songs themselves, they were doing something sneaky, something important. See, music hall songs weren't just catchy tunes about nothing. They were social commentary wrapped in comedy. They mocked the rich. They celebrated the poor. They talked about things polite society pretended didn't exist. Sex, obviously, but also poverty, inequality, the absurdity of Victorian moral rules. A song about a woman's little bit of what you fancy wasn't really about food. Everyone knew it, but because it was dressed up in double meanings and winking delivery, it got past the senses. You could say things in a music hall that would get you arrested on a street corner. The authorities tried to crack down. Of course they always did. New licensing rules came in throughout the 70s and 80s. Inspectors showed up to judge whether performances were obscene. Some halls got shut down. Some performers got fined. But the music kept playing. The crowds kept coming. Because you can pass all the laws you want about what people are allowed to enjoy. People are going to enjoy things anyway. The performers who thrived were the ones who could dance on that line. Suggestive but not explicit. Mocking but not revolutionary. They knew exactly how far they could push before someone pushed back. Marie Lloyd, who'd rise to fame in the 1880s, was probably the best at this. She could sing the most innocent-sounding lyrics and make them filthy through nothing but attitude. A slight pause, a raised eyebrow, a knowing look at the audience. The words themselves were clean enough to print in her church bulletin. The performance was anything but. When inspectors demanded she clean up her act, she proved a point by singing a perfectly innocent nursery rhyme with such suggestive delivery that it sounded obscene. The lyrics weren't the problem. She was the problem, and the audiences loved her for it. That wouldn't come until later, though. Billy Harrison never saw Marie Lloyd perform. By the time she hit her peak, he'd moved on to other concerns. Marriage, children, the slow accumulation of responsibilities that shrinks your world down to what's necessary rather than what's fun. But he never forgot that night at the Canterbury. Never forgot how it felt to be part of that crowd. To sing along with hundreds of strangers to watch Bessie Bellwood command a room just by opening her mouth. The music hall gave working people something they'd never really had before, Entertainment on their terms, stars who looked and sounded like them. Songs about their lives, their loves, their struggles. It wouldn't solve their problems, wouldn't shorten their workdays or raise their wages or fix their cramped and crumbling homes. Entertainment never does that. But it made the problems bearable, gave people something to look forward to, something to talk about, something to share. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes just knowing that Saturday night exists, that there's music and laughter waiting at the end of the week, is what gets you through Monday morning. Billy understood that without ever putting it into words. He'd go back to the Canterbury, go to other halls too, spend money he probably shouldn't have spent, sing songs he couldn't quite remember sober. Worth it, every time. The city slept on around him. Sunday morning crept in, grey and quiet. Church bells would ring soon. Respectable people would put on respectable clothes and do respectable things. But for now, in the last dark hours before dawn, Billy Harrison dreamed of gaslights and grease paint, of Bessie Bellwood's voice ringing out over the crowd, of a room full of strangers who, for one evening, weren't strangers at all. The working class had found their theatre, their music, their stars, and while they celebrated in packed halls, spending their hard-earned pennies and shillings on beer and entertainment, a very different world existed just a few miles away. A world of drawing rooms and dinner parties, of piano recital and card games, of carefully curated respectability and the constant exhausting pressure to be proper. The middle class. They had their own ideas about fun, and they'd be horrified to know how much they had in common with Billy Harrison and his friends. The Whitmore family lived in Islington in a terrace house with a green front door and lace curtains in every window. Mr. Edward Whitmore was a solicitor. Not a famous one, not a wealthy one, but successful enough to employ a maid and a cook, to send his children to decent schools and to maintain the appearance of respectability that middle-class Victorian life demanded. His wife, Helen, ran the household with the precision of a military commander. Every surface polished, every meal planned days in advance, every social engagement tracked in a leather diary she kept locked in her writing desk. They had 2 children, Elalina, 17, who played piano beautifully and wished she could do almost anything else, and Frederick, 14, who was supposed to be studying Latin, but spent most of his time thinking about cricket. It was Saturday evening in the Whitmore household, October 1875, and entertainment was about to happen, whether anyone wanted it or not. Frederick, put down that book and come to the drawing room. But, Mother, it's not a novel, it's educational. I don't care if it's the Bible itself. We have guests arriving in an hour, and you need to be presentable. Frederick sighed the sigh of a 14-year-old boy who's been asked to do something boring. He'd been reading about the Australian cricket tour, which his mother definitely would not consider educational. But he closed the book, straightened his collar, and trudged downstairs. The drawing room was already being prepared. The maid, Sarah, was lighting extra candles. The fire had been built up despite the mild weather because a proper drawing room should be warm. Elalina sat at the piano, running through scales with the expression of someone serving a prison sentence. "Who's coming tonight?" Frederick asked, slumping into a chair before his mother could tell him to sit up straight. "The Hendersons. Mr. Henderson works with your father and the Clarks. Mrs. Clark is on the church flower committee with me. So boring people." Frederick had met the Hendersons before. Mr. Henderson talked about nothing but property law. Mrs. Henderson talked about nothing but her digestive troubles. The Clarks, he didn't know. But church flower committee didn't exactly promise excitement. Will there be other children? "The Hendersons are bringing their daughter. She's 15. Frederick perked up slightly, then caught Elalina's eye and saw her shaking her head in warning. Right. He'd met the Henderson daughter before, too. She'd spent the entire evening talking about embroidery patterns. "And the Clarks have a son your age," his mother continued. "Perhaps you two can discuss your studies." Wonderful. An evening of property law, digestive, troubles, embroidery, and Latin. Frederick wondered if it was too late to develop a sudden illness. The guests arrived at 7. There was the usual flurry of greetings in the hallway, coats being taken, compliments about the house, even though everyone had seen it dozens of times before. Then everyone filed into the drawing room and arranged themselves on the furniture like chess pieces taking their positions. For the first hour they talked. This was the main event really, conversation. Carefully managed, carefully polite, carefully boring. Mr. Henderson did indeed discuss property law at length. Frederick's father nodded along and made interested noises, even though Frederick could tell he'd heard all of this before. Mrs. Henderson mentioned her stomach twice in the first 15 minutes. The adults drank cherry. The children were given lemonade that was slightly too warm and slightly too sweet. Frederick found himself sitting next to Arthur Clark, the son his age. Arthur was pale and serious, looking with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. "Do you play cricket?" Frederick asked hopefully. "No, I'm not permitted. Mother says it's too rough. Football also too rough." "What do you do then?" Arthur brightened slightly. "I collect stamps. I have over 300 from 12 different countries." Frederick tried very hard to look interested. Failed. Across the room, Elalina was trapped in conversation with Margaret Henderson, the embroidery enthusiast. Frederick caught fragments of it. Something about cross-stitch. Something about thread counts. Elalina's smile was fixed in place like it had been painted on. This was middle-class entertainment. This was what respectable people did with their Saturday evenings. They sat in drawing rooms and talked about property and stamps and embroidery and pretended to enjoy it. But then something shifted. Mrs. Whitmore stood up and clapped her hands lightly. "I thought we might have some music before dinner. Elalina, dear, would you play for us?" Elalina rose from her seat with the resignation of someone walking to the gallows. She settled herself at the piano, adjusted the sheet music, and began to play Chopin, one of the nocturnes, slow and melancholy, and actually quite beautiful. The room went quiet, not the polite silence of people waiting for something to be over, but genuine attention. Mr. Henderson stopped mid-sentence about deed transfers. Mrs. Henderson forgot about her stomach. Even Arthur Clark looked up from examining his fingernails. Elalina played well, really well. Frederick knew his sister found the endless practice tedious, knew she resented being displayed like a trained monkey for guests, but when she actually played, something happened. Her fingers moved across the keys with the certainty she never showed anywhere else. Her face relaxed. She stopped being Eleanor the beautiful daughter and became something else entirely. The piece lasted maybe 5 minutes. When it ended, there was a moment of genuine silence, then applause, warmer and more sincere than the usual polite clapping. "Wonderful," Mrs. Clark said. "Simply wonderful." Elena ducked her head, half embarrassed, half pleased. "Thank you. Play another," Margaret Henderson said. "Please, something cheerful this time." So Elalina played something cheerful, a popular song that everyone knew, the kind of thing you'd hear barrel organs playing on street corners, the kind of thing that in different circumstances factory workers might sing along to in a pub. But here, in this drawing room, it was respectable, because Elalina played it on a proper piano, in a proper house for proper people. Mrs. Whitmore started singing along, softly. Then Mrs. Clark joined in. Then, surprisingly, Mr. H. Anderson, who turned out to have a decent baritone voice that nobody had ever heard, because he was always too busy talking about property, law. Frederick watched this happen with something like wonder. These boring adults, these proper, respectable people with their sherry and their small talk, were suddenly acting almost human, singing together, smiling at each other, actually enjoying themselves. When the song ended, everyone laughed. Not polite laughter, real laughter, the kind that comes from shared pleasure. "I haven't sung that in years," Mr. Henderson said. "Used to hear it at the halls when I was young." "Frederick's," Mother raised an eyebrow. "The halls, Mr. Henderson?" A brief awkwardness. Mr. Henderson had just admitted to attending music halls, those vulgar dens of working-class entertainment. Not the kind of thing a respectable solicitor should mention in polite company. But then Mr. Whitmore smiled. I saw Marie Lloyd once before she was famous. Remarkable performer. Edward. Mrs. Whitmore looked genuinely shocked. Oh, Helen, it was years ago. Before we were married, a man's allowed a few youthful indiscretions, and just like that, the room relaxed. Again, the careful mask slipped a little further. Mrs. Clark admitted she'd always wanted to see a music hall show but never dared. Mr. Henderson confessed that his brother still went regularly and always came back with the most scandalous stories. The children exchanged glances. Watching adults admit to being human was always strange. Dinner was served at 8. The formal dining room, the good china, the elaborate ritual of courses and conversation. But something had loosened since the singing. The talk flowed easier. People actually listened to each other instead of just waiting for their turn to speak. After dinner, they returned to the drawing room for games. This was Frederick's favorite part of any evening because Mez meant actual activity instead of just sitting and talking. Tonight his mother had planned charades. Teams, she announced, whites against our guests. The rules were explained for anyone who didn't know them. One person acts out a word or phrase using only gestures. Their team tries to guess. No speaking, no props, no mouth words. Mr. Henderson went first for the guest. Team. He stood in the middle of the room, thought for a moment, then began acting out something. He put his hand on his heart. He staggered. He fell to his knees. Death, Mrs. Henderson shouted. Dying, Margaret added. Illness, disease, plague. Mr. Henderson shook his head and kept acting. He clutched his chest more dramatically. He swooned. Love, Mrs. Clark guessed. Mr. Henderson nodded vigorously and held up one finger. First word. The game continued. Turned out Mr. Henderson was surprisingly good at charades. He threw himself into each performance with an enthusiasm nobody would have expected from someone who spent his days drafting contracts. By the end of his turn, he was red-faced and laughing, and he'd successfully communicated love's labors lost. Ella Lanena went next for the whitesaw. She'd drawn a Midsummer Night's Dream and managed to convey it through an elaborate pantomime involving pretending to be a fairy and then pretending to sleep. Frederick guessed it, which earned him a rare approving look from his mother. Then Arthur Clark took a turn, and something unexpected happened. The quiet stamp-collecting boy who wouldn't play cricket transformed into a remarkably skilled mime. His phrase was, "the Quick Papers," and he somehow managed to act out a fat man, a court case, and the act of writing, all without saying a word. "You're good at this, Frederick," said afterward, surprised into honesty. Arthur shrugged. "I practice in my room. It's something to do." Frederick felt a small pang of sympathy. Maybe stamp collecting Arthur wasn't so different from him after all, just another kid looking for ways to make the endless, respectable hours pass. The games continued until nearly 10. Charades gave way to Consequences, a game where everyone writes parts of a story on folded paper without seeing what came before. The results were read aloud to general hilarity. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Frederick's father, read, keeping his face perfectly straight, met Queen Victoria in a coal mine. He said to her, "Your hat is on fire." She said to him, "That's what you think." And the consequence was they both turned into frogs. Even Mrs. Whitmore laughed at that one. Actually laughed. Not her polite hostess laugh, but a real one. That made her snort slightly, which made everyone laugh harder. The evening wound down around 10, but before the coats were retrieved, Mrs. Clark leaned forward with a conspiratorial whisper. "I almost forgot. I've arranged something rather special for next Saturday. A spirit medium is coming to our house, Madame Celestine. She's been to the Duchess of Somerset's home, apparently." The room went very quiet. Spiritualism had been sweeping through respectable parlors for the past decade. Ever since those American sisters, the Fox girls, had started claiming they could communicate with the dead, the craze had spread across the Atlantic and into every corner of middle-class life. Seances, table-turning, spirits rapping on walls and speaking through entranced mediums. The church wasn't happy about it. Some scientists called it nonsense. But that didn't stop thousands of perfectly sensible people from dimming their lamps, joining hands around their dining tables, and trying to contact departed relatives. Mrs. Whitmore looked uncertain. "A séance, Mrs. Clark. I'm not sure that's entirely—" "Oh, it's all very respectable," Mrs. Clark assured her. "More of a scientific inquiry, really. Testing the boundaries of what we know about the world beyond. That was the trick of it. Call it science. And suddenly, it wasn't really fortune-telling or witchcraft. It was educated people exploring mysteries. Very different thing entirely. Or so they told themselves." "I'll come," Mr. Henderson said, surprising everyone. "Always been curious about these spirit mediums, whether there's anything to it or whether it's all parlor tricks." "I think it sounds thrilling," Margaret Henderson added, her embroidery finally forgotten. "Imagine actually speaking to someone who's passed on." Frederick exchanged a look with Ella Lanina. Their parents were actually considering this. Their proper, respectable, church-going parents were thinking about attending a séance. "We'll discuss it," Mrs. Whitmore said finally. Which meant yes, probably, and they did go as it happened. 2 weeks later, the Whites found themselves sitting in the Clarks' darkened parlor, holding hands with near strangers, while a woman in a purple turban called upon the spirits of the departed. The table moved. Everyone swore it wasn't them pushing it. Knocking sounds came from the walls. 3 raps for yes, 1 for no. The spirit of Mrs. Clark's grandmother apparently had opinions about the flower arrangements in the parlor. Madame Celestine went into a trance and spoke in a voice that wasn't quite her own, messages from beyond, warnings about investments, reassurances that deceased loved ones were happy and at peace. Was any of it real? Frederick couldn't tell. The darkness made everything feel strange. The atmosphere was heavy with expectation. When the medium's voice changed, when the table seemed to lift slightly off the ground, his heart pounded, even though his rational mind was screaming that it must be a trick. Afterward, walking home through the gas-lit streets, his parents' air unusually quiet. "What did you think?" his mother finally asked. "I think," his father said slowly, "that I have no idea what I think, and that's rather the point, isn't it?" The séance became a topic of conversation for weeks. Had the table really moved? Had anyone felt that cold draft? What about when Madame Celestine mentioned the name Robert and Mrs. Henderson had burst into tears? It was entertainment. Strange entertainment. Entertainment that made you question the nature of reality and the possibility of life after death. But entertainment, nonetheless. The middle classes loved it. The thrill of the forbidden wrapped up in the language of scientific inquiry, a chance to feel something real in their carefully controlled lives. Some people became true believers. Others remained skeptical but kept attending anyway. Most fell somewhere in between, enjoying the experience without committing to any particular explanation. Frederick never did figure out if any of it was genuine. Years later, he'd read about how mediums faked their effects, hidden wires, accomplices, tricks with phosphorescent paint, the whole industry exposed as fraud. But he'd also remember that night in the Clarks' parlor, the darkness, the anticipation, the moment when the table moved and everyone gasped. Real or fake, the experience had been real enough. That was the thing about Victorian entertainment. Sometimes the line between genuine and performance didn't matter as much as you'd think. What mattered was the feeling, the escape, the sense of touching something beyond the ordinary. Even respectable middle-class people, it turned out, wanted a little magic in their lives. Back to that first Saturday evening, though, coats were retrieved, goodbyes were said, plans were made for future gatherings that everyone would pretend to dread but secretly look forward to. Frederick stood in the hallway watching the guests leave, tired in that good way you get after an evening that was actually fun. "That was better than usual," he said to Eleanina. She nodded. "The singing helped. It always does. Breaks the ice somehow. Do you think Mr. Henderson really went to music halls? Probably. They all did when they were young before they got respectable. There was something sad in the way she said it, like respectability was a disease you caught and couldn't shake off. But Frederick thought about the evening differently. Yes, there had been boring parts, the property law, the stamps, the endless small talk about nothing. But there had been good parts too. The music, the games, the moment when all these proper adults forgot to be proper and just enjoyed themselves. Maybe that was what entertainment was for. Not just killing time or showing off or following the rules of social engagement, but finding those moments when the masks slip, when people stop performing their roles and actually connect with each other. The working class had their pubs and music halls. The middle class had their drawing rooms and dinner parties. Different settings, different rules. Same basic human need. Frederick helped Sarah clear the last of the glasses from the drawing room. The fire was dying down now, the candles guttering, the house settling back into its ordinary quiet. His mother appeared in the doorway. "Bed, Frederick. Church tomorrow." "Yes, mother." He climbed the stairs to his room, still thinking about the evening, about Mr. Henderson singing, about Arthur Clarke's unexpected talent for charades, about Eleanor at the piano becoming someone else entirely for those few minutes. Tomorrow would be church with its hard pews and long sermons. Monday would be school with its Latin and arithmetic and masters who seemed to have forgotten what fun was. The week would stretch out ahead of him, full of duties and expectations. But Saturday would come around again, another evening, another chance to sit in the drawing room and pretend to enjoy conversations about property law, and maybe if they were lucky, someone would suggest music, someone would start singing. The masks would slip again just for a little while. Frederick fell asleep quickly, which is more than you can say for a lot of Victorian children. His room was comfortable. His bed was warm. His stomach was full from dinner. Not so different from you right now, actually. Lying there in your warm bed, comfortable and fed and safe. The technology changed. The furniture changed. The feeling of sinking into sleep at the end of a long day, that stayed exactly the same. While Frederick dreamed of cricket matches, he wasn't allowed to play. His parents sat in the drawing room for a few more minutes. The house was quiet now. The performance of the evening was over. "That went well," Helen said. Edward nodded. "The Hendersons are good people under all the talk about property law. Did you really see Marie Lloyd perform?" A pause once. Just once. "I was 19. "Was she good?" Another pause longer this time. "She was magnificent." Helen considered this. Her husband, young and irresponsible, sneaking off to a music hall to watch a singer who was famous for her risque performances. It should have shocked her. Instead, she found herself smiling. "Maybe," she said slowly, "we could go sometime to one of the more respectable halls, just to see what all the fuss is about." Edward looked at his wife with something like surprise. "Really? I'm not dead yet, Edward. I can be curious about things." They sat together in the dying firelight, two respectable middle-class people contemplating a small rebellion. They probably wouldn't actually go. The risk to their reputation, the fear of being seen, the weight of propriety, all of it would probably win in the end. But for a moment they thought about it. Imagine themselves in a crowded hall laughing at jokes they shouldn't laugh at, singing along to songs they shouldn't know. The same basic human need, breaking through even here in this careful, respectable house with its lace curtains and polished surfaces. Entertainment finds a way. Summer came to Islington and the Whitmore family moved outdoors. Their back garden wasn't large, just a rectangle of grass, bordered by flower beds with a small shed at the far end where the gardener kept his tools. But in the summer of 1876 it became the center of the household social life. Because the Whitmores had discovered croquet, the craze had swept through middle-class England over the past decade. Suddenly every family with a patch of lawn needed mallets and hoops and brightly colored balls. Equipment that would have seemed ridiculous 20 years earlier was now essential for anyone who wanted to be considered properly social. Mr. Whitmore had resisted at first. "It's a game," he said. "I'm a grown man. I have cases to prepare." But then the Hendersons got a croquet set, and the Clarks and every other family they knew. And Mrs. Whitmore pointed out quite reasonably that it was difficult to accept invitations to croquet parties if you didn't know how to play. So he learned. They all did. On this particular Saturday afternoon, the Whites were hosting. The garden had been prepared with military precision, hoops set at regulation distances, balls polished, a small table with lemonade and sandwiches set up in the shade. Frederick was actually excited, which surprised even him. Croquet had seemed boring when his mother first explained it. Hit a ball through some hoops. How hard could that be? Turns out pretty hard, and also weirdly competitive. "That's my ball you're aiming at," Ella Lanana said, watching her brother line up his shot. "No, you're going to knock me into the flower bed." "I know," Frederick swung. His ball connected with Ella Lana's with a satisfying crack and sent it rolling into the roses. "Frederick, it's called strategy." Their mother sighed from her position near the third hoop. "Children, please. We have guests." The guests were the Hendersons again, minus the daughter who was visiting an aunt somewhere. Mr. Henderson had revealed himself to be surprisingly ruthless at croquet. His wife, despite her constant complaints about her health, could aim a mallet with deadly accuracy. The game proceeded through the warm afternoon. Balls clicked against each other. Players groaned when their shots went wide. Small victories were celebrated with raised lemonade glasses. And here's the thing about croquet that nobody talks about. It was one of the few games where men and women could play together as equals, same rules, same equipment, same chance of winning. In a world where women weren't allowed to vote, couldn't own property after marriage, and were generally expected to sit quietly and look decorative, croquet was almost radical. Ladies in their long dresses, swinging mallets, competing directly against gentlemen and sometimes beating them. Mrs. Henderson won the first game. She tried to be modest about it, but you could tell she was pleased. "Beginner's luck," Mr. Henderson muttered. "I've been playing for 3 years, dear, still." The second game went to Mr. Whitmore, who celebrated with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. The third was abandoned halfway through when clouds rolled in and the first drops of rain began to fall. Everyone retreated inside for tea, grass-stained and happy. "We should do this more often," Mrs. Henderson said, settling into a chair with her cup. "The fresh air does wonders." She was right. Something about being outdoors, moving around, actually doing something physical. It changed the mood. The conversation flowed easier than it had during winter drawing-room visits. People laughed more, talked less about property law and digestive troubles. Frederick found himself actually looking forward to the next croquet afternoon, which was a strange feeling, looking forward to a social event with adults. Croquet wasn't the only new game taking over middle-class gardens either. Lawn tennis had arrived from somewhere, and it was spreading fast, faster than croquet. Actually, the Hendersons had just put up a net, and Mr. Henderson was already talking about forming a club. Tennis was quicker than croquet, more athletic. You actually worked up a sweat, which was somehow considered acceptable now. Ladies could play too, though they had to do it in their long dresses and corsets, which couldn't have been comfortable, but they played anyway. Hit the ball back and forth across the net, laughed when they missed, celebrated when they won. The Victorians were discovering something that seems obvious now. Exercise was actually fun. Moving your body, competing with friends, being outside in the fresh air. Revolutionary stuff. Frederick had also started noticing something else on the streets of London. Bicycles, not many yet. The early ones looked terrifying. Giant front wheel, tiny back wheel. The rider perched up top like someone who'd made a serious mistake. Penny farthings, people called them. One wrong move and you'd go flying over the handlebars. But the new safety bicycles were different. 2 wheels the same size, much closer to the ground. Still wobbly, still strange, but actually rideable by normal people. Some young men had started cycling to work. A few brave young women had taken it up too, which was causing all sorts of scandals about whether ladies should be allowed to ride bicycles and what kind of clothes they should wear if they did. The Rational dress reformers loved it. The traditionalists were horrified. Frederick wanted one desperately. His mother said absolutely not. His father said maybe when he was older. The usual parental stalling tactics, but he watched the cyclist go past and imagined what it would feel like. That speed, that freedom, going wherever you wanted, whenever you wanted, without needing a horse or a carriage or a train. Ticket. The future rolling past on 2 wheels, but summer offered more than garden games and bicycle dreams. A few weeks later, the Whitmore did something they'd been talking about for years. They took a holiday. Not a long one, just 4 days, but 4 days away from London, away from the routine, away from everything familiar. They went to Brighton. The journey itself was an adventure. They'd taken trains before, of course. Everyone took trains by 1876. But this was different. This was a journey to somewhere fun, not somewhere beautiful. The family rose early, dressed in their traveling clothes, and took a cab to Victoria Station. The platform was crowded with other families doing exactly the same thing. Children running between legs, porters hauling luggage, the smell of steam and coal and excitement. Their train left at 9. Second-ass compartment, which Mr. Whitmore insisted, was perfectly respectable. The seats were padded. The windows let in light and air. Frederick pressed his face to the glass as London gave way to countryside. Fields, actual fields with actual cows in them. Frederick had seen cows before, obviously, but somehow seeing them roll past the train window felt different, like the world was bigger than he'd realized. The journey took about an hour. By the time they pulled into Brighton Station, Elalina had read half a novel, and Mrs. Whitmore had worried aloud approximately 47 times about whether their lodgings would be acceptable. They were acceptable. A boarding house on a quiet street run by a widow named Mrs. Peaton, who had strong opinions about breakfast times and weak opinions about everything else. The rooms were small but clean. The beds were narrow but soft enough. The view from the upstairs window showed a sliver of sea if you leaned at the right angle. Perfect, Mr. Whitmore declared. Frederick wasn't sure about perfect, but it was definitely different, and different was good. They spent the first afternoon just walking down to the seafront, along the promenade, past the grand hotels and the modest guest houses, and the endless parade of other holidaymakers doing exactly the same thing. The smell hit Frederick first, salt and seaweed and something else he couldn't identify. The air tasted different here, cleaner somehow despite all the people. Then the sound waves. He'd heard descriptions, read about the sea in books, but the actual sound of waves hitting the shore was nothing like he'd imagined. Bigger, more constant, a rhythm that seemed to promise something, though he couldn't say what. And then the sea itself. Frederick had seen pictures, paintings, in galleries, illustrations in books. None of them came close. The water, stretched out forever, blue, gray, and restless, broken by white caps that appeared and disappeared according to rules he didn't understand. It moved constantly. Every second, something changed. A wave rose and fell. Light shifted on the surface. The horizon stayed perfectly still, while everything in front of it churned. "It's big," he said finally, which was stupid and obvious, but it was all he could think of. "It is," his father agreed. "First time seeing it?" "Yes, I was about your age. First time. Came with my father on business. Spent the whole trip just staring at it." They stood there together, father and son, watching the waves. One of those moments that doesn't feel important at the time, but stays with you anyway. The rest of the holiday blurred together in the best possible way. They walked on the pier, which stretched out over the water on iron legs that seemed impossibly thin for the weight they were holding. They ate ices from a vendor cart. They listened to a brass band playing in a pavilion, while seagulls wheeled overhead. Mrs. Whitmore discovered a tea room she declared almost as good as the one on Regent Street. Elalina found a bookshop and had to be physically dragged away. Mr. Whitmore spent an entire morning just sitting on a bench doing absolutely nothing, which he claimed was the most restful experience of his life. And Frederick went swimming, or rather he went bathing, which was what respectable people called it. The process was complicated in ways he hadn't expected. First, you rented a bathing machine. This was basically a wooden hut on wheels decorated with stripes and pulled by a horse. You climbed inside, changed into your bathing costume, and then the horse pulled the whole thing into the water until it was deep enough to swim, without anyone on the beach seeing too much of you. Frederick emerged from his bathing machine into water that was much colder than he had expected. He yelped. A wave knocked him sideways. He went under, came up sputtering, and discovered that salt water tastes absolutely terrible. But then he found his footing, let the waves push and pull at him. Felt the strange weightlessness of floating in water that actually wanted to hold you up. "This is brilliant," he shouted to no one in particular. It really was. The cold stopped mattering after a few minutes. The taste stopped mattering after a few more. What remained was the pure physical joy of moving through water, of being picked up by waves and set down again, of floating on his back and staring at a sky that had never looked quite so blue. He stayed in until his lips were turning purple, and his mother shouted from the shore that he would catch his death. Even then he went, reluctantly. The final evening in Brighton, the family sat on the promenade and watched the sun set over the water. The sky turned orange, then pink, then a deep purple that seemed almost unreal. The sea reflected it all back, doubling the colors, creating something that no painting could capture. "We should do this every year," Ella and Anna said quietly. Their mother nodded. "Perhaps we should," and they did. Not every year, because money was sometimes tight, and obligations sometimes got in the way, but often enough that Brighton became a family tradition. A few days each summer, when the Wits stopped being respectable Islington people and became something simpler, a family on holiday, eating ices and watching waves and doing absolutely nothing productive. The train ride home was quieter than the journey there. Frederick slept most of the way, his head against the window, dreaming of water and light and the taste of salt. They weren't the only middle-class family discovering the pleasures of travel. By the 1870s, a man named Thomas Cook had built an entire business around making holidays accessible. He'd started decades earlier, organizing train trips for temperance societies, group outings where working people could escape the cities without having to plan everything themselves. Over time, the concept grew. Excursions to the seaside, tours to Scotland, eventually trips to continental Europe that would have seemed impossibly exotic a generation earlier. The idea was simple but powerful. Cook handled all the arrangements, the trains, the hotels, the schedules. You just showed up, paid your fee, and followed the group. Suddenly, travel wasn't just for aristocrats. With servants and unlimited time, anyone with a bit of money and a few days free could see places they'd only read about. Mr. Whitmore was skeptical of Cook's tours. Herded around like sheep, he called it. But Mrs. Whitmore pointed out that she'd always wanted to see Paris, and doing it with a guide who spoke French and knew where to go sounded rather more practical than trying to figure it all out themselves. Mrs. Whitmore still talked about the Great Exhibition sometimes, 1851. She'd been just a girl, but her father had taken the whole family to London to see it. The Crystal Palace, that impossible building of glass and iron that had risen in Hyde Park, like something from a fairy tale. Inside, wonders from every corner of the world, machines and inventions, art and artifacts, the future and the past, all under one roof. 6 million people visited. 6 million. In a country of 18 million, that meant 1 in 3 people came to see it. Working-class families who'd never traveled anywhere suddenly took excursion trains to London, clutching their shilling tickets, desperate to see what all the fuss was about. It had changed everything, shown people what was possible, what the world contained, what progress looked like. The Crystal Palace had been moved to Sydenham after the exhibition ended. The Whitmore went sometimes on special occasions. The building still stood, still glittered in the sunlight, still held concerts and displays and events, a permanent monument to Victorian ambition. Frederick found it impressive, but also slightly dusty. Old news. The future had already arrived, and now it was just another day, out. But for his mother's generation it remained magical, the moment when the world opened up and showed them how big it really was. They never did make it to Paris. The children grew up, responsibilities multiplied, the moment passed as moments do, but the dream stayed. The idea that the world was bigger than Islington, bigger than London, bigger than England, that somewhere out there, other cities waited to be seen, other seas waited to be swam, in other experiences waited to be had. That dream, that restlessness, that hunger for something beyond the ordinary. It was its own kind of entertainment, planning trips that might never happen, reading about places you might never go, imagining yourself somewhere else, someone else, living a different kind of life. The Whitmore came back from Brighton with sunburned noses and sandy shoes and a feeling of contentment that lasted for weeks. The drawing-room games continued, the dinner parties resumed, but something had shifted. They tasted the outside world and they wanted more. Autumn came, then winter. The croquet, mallets went back in the shed. The garden turned muddy and bare. But already Mrs. Whitmore was talking about next summer, maybe Bournemouth this time, or Eastbourne or somewhere entirely new. The routine of middle-class life continued, work and church and social obligations. But threaded through it all, like a bright ribbon through grey fabric, ran the memory of waves and salt air and 4 days when nothing mattered but being together. You might be feeling something similar right now. That drowsy contentment that comes from being comfortable and safe and warm. Your own bed instead of a Brighton boarding house. Your own pillow instead of a rented one. But the feeling is the same. That settling sensation. That release of tension you didn't know you were holding. The world getting quieter, softer, further away. The Whitmore found their escape in croquet games and seaside holidays, brief breaks in the routine, moments when they could stop being respectable and just be themselves. Same thing you're doing right now, really taking a break, letting your mind wander somewhere else, letting someone else's story carry you away from your own for a while. The method. Change. The need doesn't. Summer would come again for the Whitmore family. More croquet, more travel, more of those precious moments when the rules relaxed and life felt lighter. But for now, let's leave them in that autumn quiet. Mr. Whitmore reading by the fire. Mrs. Whitmore planning imaginary trips in her leather diary. Ella Lenina practicing piano but playing what she wants instead of what she should. Frederick already asleep upstairs, dreaming of waves that stretch on forever. A comfortable household, a comfortable life, entertainment that fit within the boundaries of what was proper, with just enough wildness around the edges to keep things interesting. And miles away, in houses so grand they made the Whitmore residence look like a garden shed, an entirely different world, was preparing for its own kind of fun. The aristocracy, the people who didn't just take holidays, but owned the places other people holidayed in, who didn't play croquet in back gardens, but on lawns, the size of small villages. Their entertainment operated on a completely different scale, and their rules, such as they were, bore almost no resemblance to the careful propriety of middle-class Islington. But that's a world unto itself, a world of country houses and hunting parties and balls that lasted until dawn. We'll get there. For now, rest. Let the imaginary waves of Brighton lap at the edges of your thoughts. Let the salt air fill your imaginary lungs. Let yourself drift the way Frederick drifted, in the water, held up by something larger than yourself. The story continues, but it's not going anywhere. It'll be here when you're ready. Lord, Arthur Peaton woke at 5 a.m. to the sound of dogs. Not an unpleasant sound exactly. The hounds were excited, and excited hounds made a particular kind of music, but it was very, very early, and Lord Arthur had been up until 2 playing cards. Do I? Guests who cheated badly and drank even worse. Still, today was the hunt, and you didn't miss the hunt. Highgrove Manor sat on 12,000 acres of Leicester countryside. The house itself was massive. 40 bedrooms, a ballroom that could hold 300, servants' quarters that were bigger than most middle-class homes, the kind of place that made visitors stop talking mid-sentence when they first saw it. Lord Arthur was 32 years old and had lived here his entire life. The house had been in the Peaton family for 6 generations. Somewhere in the East Wing, portraits of all those previous Peatons lined a gallery, watching the current generation, with painted eyes that seemed vaguely disapproving. He rang for his valet. Jenkins appeared, within minutes, already carrying the hunting clothes that had been laid out the night before. "Good morning, my lord. Is it? Feels early." "The weather is excellent for hunting, my lord. Clear skies, light breeze." Arthur grunted and let Jenkins help him into the complicated layers of a proper hunting outfit. White breeches, tall black, boots, a white cravat tied just so, and the scarlet coat that marked him as a member of the hunt. Red coats, that's what most people called them, though. Technically, the color was pink, named after some tailor from centuries back. The distinction mattered to people who cared about such things. Arthur didn't, particularly, but he wore the coat anyway because that's what Peatons did. By 6, he was downstairs. The great hall was already full of guests. 23 people had come for the weekend, specifically for the hunting. Lords and ladies, sons and daughters, a few cousins of questionable closeness, all of them dressed in their riding clothes, all of them making the kind of bright conversation that only the truly well-rested or the truly hung-over could manage. Arthur was definitely the latter. He found some coffee and drank it quick. Cly, hoping it would push back the headache forming behind his eyes. His sister Charlotte appeared at his elbow. She was dressed for riding too, though she'd be following the hunt rather than leading it. Side saddle naturally. Proper ladies? Didn't ride astride. "You look terrible," she said cheerfully. "Thank you. How much did you lose to Lord Fitzhugh? Enough? More than 1,000? Arthur didn't answer, which was answer enough. Charlotte laughed and went to find her own coffee. By 6, everyone had assembled outside. The horses were ready. The hounds were barely contained, pulling at their handlers, desperate to run. The morning air was cold enough to see your breath, and the grass crunched, slightly underfoot from overnight frost. Arthur mounted his horse, a grey mare, named Duchess, who had more sense than most of the people present. She knew what was coming. You could feel it in the way she held herself, alert, ready. The master of the hunt gave a short speech that Arthur had heard 100 times before. Something about tradition, something about sport, something about the noble pursuit of the fox. Then the horn sounded and everything changed. The hounds were released. They took off across the frost-covered field, noses down, following a scent that no human could detect. Behind them came the riders, 20-odd, horses thundering across the Learshire countryside like a scarlet wave. Arthur forgot about his headache, forgot about the cards and the money and the painted ancestors watching from their frames. There was only this, the horse beneath him, the cold air in his lungs, the sound of hooves and hounds, and his own heart pounding. They jumped a hedge, then a ditch, then a stone wall that had been standing since before the Pembertons owned this land. Duchess cleared each obstacle without hesitation. She'd done this as many times as Arthur had, probably enjoyed it more. The fox somewhere ahead was running for its life. Arthur didn't think about that part much. You weren't supposed to. The fox was the excuse for all of this, the reason everyone could pretend there was a purpose to their mourning. But really, the fox was almost beside the point. This was about the ride, the chase, the feeling of being alive in a way that drawing rooms and dinner parties could never provide. They rode for almost 2 hours across fields and through woods, past tenant farmers who stopped their work to watch the spectacle go by, through a stream that soaked Arthur's boots and made Duchess snort with annoyance. Somewhere around 8, the hounds lost the scent. The fox had escaped, probably, gone to ground in some hole they couldn't reach. The master called off the chase. Arthur pulled Duchess to a stop, breathing hard. His hands were frozen. His thighs ached from gripping the saddle. He was covered in mud from a near miss at the stream crossing. He felt absolutely wonderful. The riders regrouped slowly, making their way back toward Highrove. The pace was leisurely now, the urgency gone, just a group of people on horses talking and laughing, reliving the moments of the chase. "Did you see Fitzhugh take that hedge?" someone called out. "I thought he was going over for certain. My horse refused the wool completely. Had to go around like some kind of amateur. The fox was clever, doubled back twice before we lost him. This was the other part of the hunt, the stories, the shared experience that would be retold at dinner, and again at breakfast, and probably for years afterward. Remember that hunt at High Grove? Remember when the fox led us through the stream? They arrived back at the manor, around 10. Grooms took the horses. Servants appeared with warm towels and hot drinks. The guests dispersed to their rooms to change out of their muddy clothes before the hunt breakfast. Hunt breakfast was a misleading name. It was really more of a feast. The dining room had been set with enough food to feed a small army. Eggs and bacon and sausages and kedgeree and cold ham and hot toast and about 6 different kinds of pastry, plus wine for those who wanted to start early and tea and coffee for those who didn't. Arthur filled a plate and found a seat near the fire. His sister joined him, still flushed from the ride. "Good hunt," she said. "The fox got away. They usually do. That's not really the point, is it?" She was right. The point was everything else, the riding, the company, the excuse to do something physical and exciting while still being perfectly respectable. The upper classes had figured something out about entertainment. If you dress it up in tradition, if you give it rules and rituals, if you make it expensive enough that only certain people can participate, you can do things that would seem absurd otherwise. Chasing a fox across the countryside for 2 hours, ridiculous. But call it a hunt. Put everyone in special coats. Make it a social occasion, with carefully managed guest lists, and suddenly it's the height of civilized behavior. Arthur thought about this sometimes, not often. He wasn't much for philosophy, but occasionally, usually after a long ride and before the wine kicked in, he wondered if the whole thing was just an elaborate game that everyone had agreed to play. Then the wine did kick in, and he stopped wondering. The afternoon brought different entertainment. Some guests retired to their rooms to rest. Others gathered in the library for cards and conversation. A few hardy souls went out for a walk around the grounds. Arthur found himself in the billiards room with Lord Fitzhugh and 2 others. The game was friendly enough, money changing hands in, amounts that would have paid a factory worker's wages for a year. "Shooting tomorrow?" Fitzhugh asked, lining up a shot. "Pheasants should be excellent. The gamekeeper says the birds are plentiful this year. I'll finally beat you. You've been saying that for a decade. This time I mean it. You said that before the Tigant in India, and then you shot a tree. It was dark. It was noon." The others laughed. Fitzhugh had the good grace to laugh too. His trip to India the previous year had become legendary, but not in the way he'd hoped. He'd gone out expecting to bag a tiger and come home a hero. Instead, he'd spent 3 weeks being bitten by mosquitoes, terrified of snakes, and failing to hit anything more threatening than local vegetation. That was the thing about aristocratic travel. The stories you told and the reality you experienced were often 2 very different things. Lord Westbrook had gone to Africa on safari last year, came back with photographs and tales of lion. Conveniently didn't mention that he'd spent most of the trip suffering from dysentery and had to be carried back to camp after attempting to shoot an elephant and hitting his own bearer's water canteen instead. Lady Ashworth's nephew had done the grand tour. Venice, Rome, Athens, all the classical sites, returned with a collection of antiquities that turned out to be mostly forgeries, and a case of something the doctors refused to name in polite company. But the stories were always magnificent. Adventures in exotic lands, danger narrowly avoided. Trophies acquired through skill and bravery rather than through paying local guides to do all the actual work. The upper classes could go anywhere in the world by the 1870s. Steamships, railways, the reach of the British Empire extending into every corner of the globe. Want to hunt tigers? India's right there. Want to see the pyramids? Egypt's practically civilized now. Want to ski in the Alps or recover from consumption on the French Riviera? Just book passage and go Money opened doors. Money opened continents. But most of the aristocracy, most of the time stayed home and pretended their adventures were more exciting than they actually were, which was its own kind of entertainment, really. They played until dinner, which was at 8, formal dress required. Arthur changed into his evening clothes with Jenkins' help, checking his reflection in the mirror. White tie and tails, diamond studs in his shirt, every detail correct. You had to get the details right when you were hosting. Dinner was a production. 18 courses served over 3 hours. Soup and fish and game and meat and pudding and cheese and fruit, each with its own wine, each served by footmen who moved so silently they might have been ghosts. The conversation flowed according to unwritten rules. Politics with the gentleman on your right for the first half. Lie. Topics with the ladies on your left for the second. No controversial opinions, no boring stories, no lingering too long on any single subject. Arthur played his part. He'd been playing it since he was old enough to hold a fork correctly, say the right things, laugh at the right moments, keep everyone comfortable and entertained without actually revealing anything about yourself. It was exhausting, honestly, but it was also what he'd been trained for since birth. The eldest son of an earl hosting guests at the family estate. This was his job, his purpose, the thing the Pitons had always done. After dinner, the men retired to the smoking room while the ladies went to the drawing room. Port and cigars for the gentlemen, tea and gossip for the women. Another Victorian ritual that divided the sexes according to rules nobody questioned anymore. Arthur sat with his port and listened to Lord Fitzhugh tell a story about a horse he'd bought that turned out to be half blind. It was good story told well. Everyone laughed at the right moments. Then someone suggested cards and the evening's real entertainment began. They played baccarat, which was technically illegal but widely ignored among people who mattered. The stakes started moderate and climbed higher as the night went on. Arthur won some hands, lost others. By midnight he was roughly even, which felt like a victory against Fitzhugh's erratic betting. The ladies rejoined them around 1 in the morning, a few dances in the ballroom for those who still had energy. Someone played piano. Someone else sang badly but enthusiastically. Arthur found himself standing by a window, looking out at the dark grounds. Somewhere out there, the fox they chased that morning was probably settling into its den, unaware that 20-odd aristocrats had spent their morning trying to catch it, unaware that its escape would be discussed over breakfast for the next week. Strange creatures, humans, build massive houses, fill them with expensive things, create elaborate rituals around chasing animals and hitting balls and moving pieces across boards, all in the name of entertainment. But it worked. It filled the hours. It gave people something to do with their time and money and energy. It created shared experiences that bound the upper classes together into something like a community, not so different really from Billy Harrison singing in his pub or Frederick Whitmore playing croquet in his garden. The scale was different, the money was different, but the underlying need was the same. Something to do, someone to do it with, a reason to get up in the morning even when you didn't have to work. The guests began drifting off to bed. Arthur made his round, saying good night to everyone, making sure the servants knew which rooms needed extra fires. The duties of a host never quite ended. By 3 in the morning, the house was finally quiet. Arthur stood in the great hall alone, listening to the silence. Tomorrow there would be more shooting, more meals, more conversation, more cards. The weekend would continue until Monday, when the guests would depart and Highgrove would return to its everyday emptiness. He climbed the stairs to his room slowly. Jenkins had already been and gone. The fire was built up. The bed was turned down. A glass of water sat on the nightstand, because Jenkins knew that Arthur would need it after all the port. The room was large and cold despite the fire. Portraits of ancestors lined these walls too. Putins in wigs, peons in armor, peons in clothes that had been fashionable a century ago. Arthur undressed and climbed into bed. The sheets were cold at first, but warmed quickly. The mattress was soft. The pillows were perfect. not so different, from your bed, probably minus the portraits, and the 12,000 acres and the servants. But the feeling of sinking into softness at the end of a long day, that's universal. Lord Arthur Petton closed his eyes and thought about the hunt. The moment when Duchess cleared that stone wall, the feeling of flying just for a second, before gravity reasserted itself. That was worth all of it. The headache and the obligations and the endless performance of being a piton. For those few seconds of flight, it was all worth it. Tomorrow would bring the shooting. Arthur was a decent shot. Not the best among his friends, but consistent. He'd bag his share of pheasants, act suitably pleased, congratulate Fitzhugh when he finally hit something. Then Sunday, church in the family chapel, a long lunch, perhaps a walk around the lake, the slow unwinding of the weekend before Monday's departures. And then, soon enough, something else. A ball in London, a race meeting at Newmarket, another house, party at another estate with another set of guests. The calendar of the aristocracy was always full, always another event, another occasion, another opportunity to see and be seen. It could feel like a burden sometimes, all that entertainment, all that obligation, dressed up as pleasure. But right now, in the warm darkness of his bedroom, Arthur Petton felt something like contentment. The hunt had been good. The dinner had been successful. His guests seemed happy. Tomorrow would take care of itself. For now, sleep deep and dreamless and well-deserved. The great house settled around him. 40 bedrooms full of sleeping guests. Servants finishing their work in distant wings. Horses in the stables, dogs in the kennels, the fox somewhere out in the dark. Alive for another day. All of them. Part of the same strange dance. The eternal human pursuit of something to do, something to feel, something to share. Entertainment, even at this level, even with unlimited money and endless time. That's what it came down to. Find your ways to fill the hours that felt worth filling. Spring came and Lord Arthur Petton went to London. The townhouse on Mayfair had been opened a week earlier. Servant sent ahead to remove the dust sheets, air out the rooms, stock the larder. By the time Arthur arrived in late April, everything was ready. Fresh flowers in the entrance hall, fires lit. In every room the silver polished until it hurt to look at. The season had begun. If country life was about hunting and house parties, London life was about something else entirely. Visibility, being seen at the right places with the right people. An endless parade of social events that ran from April through July when Parliament was sitting and anyone who mattered was in town. Arthur's calendar for the first week alone included 3 balls, 2 dinner parties, a charity auction, an afternoon, at the races, and at least 4 obligations he'd already forgotten about. His secretary kept track of everything. Arthur just showed up where he was told. The first stop always was the club. White sat on St. James's Street, looking much like it had for the past 150 years. Plain facade. Nothing to suggest what happened inside. You had to know what it was to know what it was. Arthur had been a member since he turned 21. His father had been a member, his grandfather, going back generations to when the club was a chocolate house and the original Mr. White served drinks to whoever could pay. Now it was something else entirely. The most exclusive gentlemen's club in London, maybe in the world. The waiting list for membership stretched years. Sons were put down at birth, and even then acceptance wasn't guaranteed. Arthur walked in around 3 in the afternoon, handed his hat to the porter, and made his way to the coffee room. The familiar smell of tobacco and leather and old money W wrapped around him like a blanket. The room was dim despite the afternoon light. Heavy curtains blocked most of the windows. Men preferred it that way. Easier to talk when you couldn't quite see each other's faces. Easier to pretend the outside world didn't exist. Old portraits lined the walls. Previous members, mostly men who'd sat in these same chairs a century ago, making the same conversations, placing the same bets. The continuity was supposed to be comforting. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it felt like being trapped in amber. Arthur found his usual chair near the fireplace. Even in spring, the fire was lit. The club was always slightly too warm, slightly too quiet, slightly too removed from anything that might be called real life. Peon wondered when you'd surface. Lord Fitzhugh, of course, same man from the hunting weekend, now dressed for town rather than country. He was sprawled in, a leather chair near the window, a newspaper open on his lap. "Just arrived this morning," Arthur said, taking the chair opposite, barely unpacked. "Ridiculous time to get here. You've already missed the Devincure ball. I'll survive the loss." A waiter appeared. Arthur ordered coffee. The club's coffee was mediocre at best. "But you didn't come here for the coffee. You came for the company, for the conversations that happened in these leather chairs, out of earshot of wives and mothers and anyone who might disapprove. Men made deals at White's, not officially. Nothing so crass as a contract signed over brandy. But understandings were reached. Alliances formed. The real business of running the country happened in rooms like this between men who'd known each other since school. Arthur wasn't much for politics himself. He sat in the House of Lords because Petons always had voted the way his father had voted and tried not to think too hard about whether any of it mattered. But he understood. The game, you had to survive at this level. The afternoon passed slowly. More friends arrived. Stories were exchanged. The betting book came out, that famous leather-bound record where members wagered on everything from elections to the weather. 20 says Harrington proposes to the Ashworth girl before June. Someone announced. 50 says she turns him down. Someone else counted. The bets were recorded. Money would change hands eventually, or it wouldn't. Half the wages in that book were never settled, forgotten as soon as they were made. Arthur placed a small bet on a horse race happening the following week. Nothing serious, just enough to have something to care about when the results came in. By 6, he excused himself. Dinner that evening with the Malbros, then a ball afterward. The season's carousel was already spinning, and he needed to get dressed. The ball was held at Grove House, a mansion so large it made Highgrove look modest. Arthur arrived at 11, which was fashionably late, but not rudely so. The ballroom was already full, hundreds of people in their finest clothes, chandeliers blazing overhead, an orchestra playing waltzes that nobody was really listening to. The heat hit him first. All those bodies, all those candles. The room shimmered with warmth and light, and the particular energy of people determined to enjoy themselves, whether they actually were or not. Women in silk and satin, men in black and white. The colors moved together like something alive swirling across the dance floor, breaking apart, reforming from above, Arthur thought. It must look like a kaleidoscope, beautiful and meaningless and constantly shifting. He made his rounds, greeting, people being greeted, the same conversations he'd had 100 times before. "Paton, good to see you. Lady Westbrook, you look lovely as always. Heard your hunt went well. Fitzhugh says the fox escaped." The why usually do. On and on, face after face, name after name. Arthur's cheeks HHD from smiling. But there were genuine moments too, old friends he hadn't seen since last season. Gossip that was actually interesting rather than just obligatory. A conversation with a young member of Parliament about land reform that made Arthur think harder than he had in months. And the dancing that was real, too. He danced with Lady Catherine Blackwood, a widow his age, who had no interest in remarrying and therefore could be actually interesting instead of just marriageable. They waltzed through 2 songs talking about nothing and everything, and for a few minutes the performance fell away. "Do you ever get tired of all this?" she asked constantly. "But you keep coming. What else would I do?" She laughed. "That's the problem, isn't it? We're not equipped for anything else." It was true. Arthur had been raised for exactly this life, these parties, these conversations, this endless carousel of social obligation. He didn't know how to do anything else, had never been taught, had never needed to learn. The bull continued until 3 in the morning. Arthur stayed until 2, which was respectable. He'd shown his face, made his connections, done his duty. The carriage ride home was quiet. London at night looked different from the daytime city. Gaslight instead of sunshine, shadows instead of crowds, the streets almost empty, except for the occasional late-night wanderer. Arthur leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes. Tomorrow there would be more. A luncheon, an afternoon event, another dinner, another ball probably. The season never stopped once it started, but for now, in the darkness of the carriage, he could rest, just for a moment, just until he got home. The days blurred together after that, each one a variation on the same theme: morning, calls, afternoon commitments, evening entertainment, sleep whenever you could fit it in. In early June, Arthur went to Royal Ascot. The racecourse sat about 30 miles from London, close enough for a day trip, far enough to feel like an escape. The racing itself was almost secondary to the real purpose of the event. This was where society displayed itself, where fashion was judged and alliances were made, and young people were carefully thrown together in hopes of suitable matches. Arthur's party travelled down in a procession of carriages, 8 people in total, including his sister Charlotte and the inevitable Lord Fitzhugh. They'd rented a private box near the finish line. Champagne was waiting, strawberries and cream, all the little luxuries that separated this experience from what ordinary people might have at a race meeting. The day was warm, unusually warm for early June. Ladies shielded themselves with parasols. Gentlemen loosened their collars when they thought nobody was watching. The grass of the racecourse glowed green in the sunshine, almost too bright to look at directly. Arthur watched the horses parade before the first race, beautiful creatures, sleek and powerful, and utterly unaware of the fortunes being wagered on their performance. They moved with a grace that humans could never match. All muscle and instinct and perfectly evolved purpose. The horses ran. Arthur bet on a few, won some, lost more. The real action was in the spaces between races, when everyone left their boxes to promenade and be seen. The fashion was elaborate. Ladies wore hats that seemed to defy physics, covered in feathers and flowers and ribbons. Gentlemen wore morning coats in shades of grey with top hats brushed to perfect smoothness. Everyone was looking at everyone else, judging and being judged. The Duchess of Bedford is wearing last year's style, Charlotte murmured as they walked. Is she that lace? Very 1874. Arthur Howe. Dee no idea how his sister tracked these things, but she did. They all did, the women. Fashion was its own language, and falling behind meant something. What exactly? Arthur couldn't say, but something. They stopped to talk with a dozen different groups. Each conversation lasted exactly as long as it needed to, long enough to be polite, short enough to suggest they had other more important people to see. The Prince of Wales was there, of course, the future king, holding court near the royal enclosure, surrounded by his particular friends. Arthur knew him slightly. They'd been at the same house parties, played cards a few times. The prince nodded as Arthur passed. Arthur nodded back. That was all. That was enough. By late afternoon, the races were winding down. The champagne had done its work. Everyone was slightly flushed, slightly tired, slightly ready to admit that standing around in elaborate clothes was actually exhausting. The carriage ride back to London felt longer than it should have. Arthur dozed against the window, half listening to Fitzhugh and Charlotte argue about something inconsequential. This was his life. This carousel of events and obligations, balls and races, and dinners and clubs, entertainment that never quite stopped, that demanded constant presence, constant performance. Sometimes Arthur wondered what it would be like to be someone else, a farmer maybe whose days had actual purpose, a shopkeeper who sold things people needed, anyone whose life wasn't this endless parade of showing up and being seen. But those were dangerous thoughts, thoughts that led nowhere good. He was a Peton. This was what Peton did, had always done, would always do. The carriage delivered him home around 10, too early for bed by London standards, too late to go out again. He sat in his study instead, just sitting, looking at nothing, letting the quiet wash over him. E-season would continue for another month. More balls, more races, more of everything he had already experienced 100 times before. And then it would end. Parliament would rise. Society would scatter to country, houses and foreign spars. The great machine would pause just for a while, before starting up again the following spring. Arthur poured himself a brandy, drank it, slowly let his mind wander where it wanted. He thought about the fox from the hunt, at High Grove, still out there somewhere, probably living its fox life, unaware of the elaborate rituals that had briefly made it important. He thought about Lady Catherine at the ball, her question, "Do you ever get tired of all this?" And his answer, which had been honest but also incomplete, he was tired. Of course he was tired. Anyone would be tired living this way. But there was something else too, something that kept him coming back season after season, year after year, the connection, the shared experience, the knowledge that everyone else in these ballrooms and boxes and clubs was playing the same game, bound by the same invisible rules. It was a kind of belonging, strange and exhausting and sometimes completely hollow, but belonging nonetheless. Your own bed is simpler, your own evening quieter. Whatever brought you to this moment, listening to stories about people long dead. It probably wasn't a gilded ballroom or a horse race attended by royalty. But maybe there's something similar that need to be part of, something to share experience with others, to feel less alone in the world, even if just for a little while. Entertainment, whatever form it takes, is really just connection wearing different clothes. Arthur finished his brandy, set the glass aside. The house was quiet around him. Servants had done their work and retreated to their quarters. The street outside was silent. Tomorrow would bring more of tea. Same. Another luncheon, another obligation, another chance to be seen and to see. But tonight was his, just sitting in the quiet, letting the carousel stop spinning, if only in his mind. He climbed the stairs slowly. The bedroom was ready as always. The bed turned down, the fire banked low, everything in its place. Lord Arthur Peaton, eldest son of an earl, heir to 12,000 acres and 6 generations of expectations, climbed into bed and closed his eyes. The sheets were cool against his skin, the pillow soft beneath his head, small. Comforts that felt larger in the darkness. The same comforts that people had sought for centuries. A soft place to land at the end of the day. Outside London continued its quiet, nighttime business. Watchmen making rounds, carriages carrying late, travellers home, the city breathing slowly in the hours between midnight and dawn. Just like Billy Harrison in his lodging house, just like Frederick Whitmore in his Islington bedroom, just like you, wherever you are, settling into the comfort of your own pillows. Different worlds, different lives, same, ending to the day. The darkness came up soft and warm. The thoughts slowed down. The endless carousel faded into something quieter, something gentler. Sleep, the great equalizer, the one entertainment that everyone shares, rich and poor alike. And in that shared experience, perhaps we find the truest connection of all. Years passed. That's how it works, isn't it? You blink and suddenly the world has shifted under your feet. 6 years to be precise. 6 years since Billy Harrison first walked into the Anchor and Crown. 6 years since Charlie Finch watched Jack Shepherd escape from prison on that rickety penny gaff stage. 6 years since Frederick Whitmore discovered that croquet was actually kind of fun, and Arthur Peaton chased his first fox across the Learshire countryside. The world had changed in those 6 years. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, like water wearing down stone. The music halls had gotten bigger, grander, more respectable. Football had exploded from a schoolboy's game into a national obsession. Tens of thousands of working men now packed into stadiums every Saturday, cheering for teams with names like Arsenal and Aston Villa and Blackburn Rovers. The roar of the crowd had become its own kind of entertainment. Bicycles were everywhere now, the safety. Bicycle had made cycling possible for ordinary people, and suddenly everyone wanted one. Young women were riding them, in public, wearing rational dress. The world was definitely changing, but some Things stayed the same. The need for escape, the hunger for joy, the desperate search for moments when you could stop surviving and start living. August Bank Holiday, 1881. The train from London was packed, every carriage full, families squeezed onto benches meant for fewer people, children, on laps, baskets of food wedged between feet, the smell of anticipation and cold, smoke, and too many bodies in too small a space. Billy Harrison sat near the window, watching the countryside roll past. He was 30 now, married with a wife named Sarah, who'd grown up 3 streets over from his old lodging house. 2 children of his own, both pressed against their mother on the opposite seat. The older one, a boy named James, kept asking if they were there yet. Soon, Billy said, for the 1000th time, soon. He'd taken James to a football match last month, West Ham against someone he couldn't remember who. The boy had been overwhelmed by the crowd, the noise, the sheer scale of it all. Thousands of men all shouting together, all caring desperately about the same thing for 90 minutes. "Can we go again?" James had asked afterward. Next month, Billy had promised. Another entertainment to look forward to, another reason to going. But today was different. Today they were going to Margate. The whole family. A proper holiday paid for with months of careful saving. 3 days away from London, 3 days of sea air and sand and doing absolutely nothing useful. The Bank Holiday Act had passed 10 years earlier. 4 days a year when banks closed and gradually everyone else followed. Days that belonged to workers as much as to anyone. Days that couldn't be taken away. Billy remembered the first August Bank Holiday, 1871, the chaos of it. Nobody quite knew what to do with a day off that wasn't Christmas or Easter. Some people went to church anyway out of habit. Others stood around looking confused. But people figured it out fast. They went places, did things, discovered that leisure wasn't just for the wealthy. The train pulled into Margate Station around noon. The platform was chaos, hundreds of families pouring out, all heading the same direction, toward the water, toward the beach, toward whatever small pleasures they could afford. Billy hoisted James onto his shoulders and led the way. The seafront was already crowded, donkeys carrying children up and down the sand, Punch and Judy shows set up at intervals, squeaky voices carrying over the crash of waves, vendors selling everything from cockles to lemonade to souvenir postcards. James wanted to see everything, touch everything. His younger sister, barely 3, wanted mostly to eat sand, which kept her mother busy. Billy stood at the edge of the water and let the waves wash over his boots. Cold, shockingly cold, but good, real. He thought about his father, who'd never seen the sea, who'd lived and died in the same square mile of East London, who'd considered a trip across the river an adventure. Things changed slowly, painfully, but they changed. A little further down the beach, a middle-aged couple sat in rented deck chairs watching the water. The man wore a straw hat that had seen better days. The woman held a parasol against the sun. Edward and Helen Whitmore taking their annual escape from Islington. The children were grown now. Elena married and living in Manchester. Frederick at university studying something practical that his mother pretended to understand. So it was just the 2 of them these days. Quieter holidays, easier to manage, a little lonely if they were honest, but they rarely were. "Remember the first time we brought them here?" Helen asked. Frederick tried to swim to France. Elena cried because her ice melted too fast. Good times. They sat in comfortable silence, watching families that reminded them of their own years ago, watching children make the same discoveries their children had made, the eternal repetition of simple pleasures. Edward had retired from the law the previous year. His hands weren't steady enough for the detailed work anymore. His eyes weren't sharp enough for the fine print. He had handed his practice to a younger man and tried to figure out what to do with all the hours that used to be filled with work. Mostly he read, walked, sat in deck chairs and watched the sea. It was enough, barely. Some days. "Ice cream?" he asked. Helen smiled. "Why not?" He went to find a vendor, leaving her alone with the sound of the waves. The rhythm of it was hypnotic, in and out, like breathing, like heartbeat, like all the rhythms that kept life moving forward whether you paid attention or not. She closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. The shouts of children, the cry of gulls, the distant tinkling of a barrel organ playing songs she half remembered from decades ago. This was what they'd worked for, wasn't it? All those years of being proper, being respectable, raising children and maintaining appearances and doing everything right for this. A deck chair on. A beach, an ice cream on a warm afternoon, peace. Edward came back with 2 cones, already melting in the heat. They ate them, quickly, laughing at the mess, not caring who saw. 2 respectable, middle-aged people with ice cream on their chins. The Whitmores weren't alone in their deck chairs. The beach was lined with them, rows of canvas and wood, all facing the water, all holding people who'd paid their sixpence for the right to sit down. Working people, middle class, people, even a few who might have been something grander, though, was hard to tell at the seaside. Everyone wore simpler clothes here. Everyone got sandy and sunburned and slightly undignified. That was the magic of it. The beach didn't care who you were. The waves treated everyone the same. A little girl ran past the Widders chasing a ball that the wind had stolen. Billy Harrison's daughter, though they'd never know that. She caught the ball near their chairs, turned and ran back toward her family without a second glance. Lives, intersecting for a moment, then separating, ships passing, as they say, up on the promenade, away from the sand. A different world moved at a different pace. Carriages rolled past carrying people who wouldn't dream of sitting on a public beach. Private bathing machines waited for those who could afford them. Tea rooms catered to those who found the crowds below distasteful. Lord Arthur Petton wasn't in Margate that day. He was in Scotland at a shooting party, doing exactly what he'd been doing every August for as long as he could remember. The bank holiday meant nothing to him. Every day was a holiday, when you didn't have to work, but his world touched this one in ways nobody thought about much. The railways that brought Billy Harrison's family to the coast were built with money from men like Arthur. The hotels and boarding houses were owned by people Arthur might have met at party. The whole machinery of leisure ran on wealth that started at the top and trickled down through countless hands. Not that anyone on the beach was thinking about economics. They were thinking about sandcastles, about whether the donkey rides were worth the penny, about how long until lunch. Charlie Finch was thinking about his daughter. 20 years had passed since that night at the Penny Gaff. Charlie was a foreman now at a different factory than the one he'd worked as a boy. Better hours, better pay, still hard work, but work with some dignity attached. His daughter was 12, old enough to remember this trip, old enough to appreciate what it meant. "Can we stay forever?" she asked, looking at the sea. 3 days? That's not forever. It's what we've got, she nodded, accepting this. Children learned early that you couldn't have everything, that you took what you could get and were grateful for it. But 3 days was something. 3 days was more than Charlie's parents had ever managed. 3 days meant progress, however slow. They built a sandcastle together, nothing fancy, a mound with a moat that the tide would eventually claim. But for an hour it was theirs, a tiny kingdom on a crowded beach. The sun moved across the sky. The crowd thinned as people went, searching for lunch, for shade, for relief from the heat. The donkeys took a break. The Punch and Judy shows paused between performances. Margate breathed in and out, in and out. By evening the beach had transformed. The families with young children had retreated to their boarding houses. The couples emerged, the young people looking for adventure, or at least something that felt like it. A brass band played on the promenade. Not a famous band, just local musicians who'd been doing this every summer for years, but the music carried across the sand, mixing with the sound of the waves, creating something that felt almost magical. People danced right there on the promenade, strangers and sweethearts and married couples and groups of friends, moving to music that belonged to everyone. Billy Harrison watched from a bench, his children long since asleep in their rented room. His wife sat beside him, her head on his shoulder. "Good day," she said. Yeah, the children loved it. So, did I. They sat and watched the dancers, the lights coming on along the pier, the stars emerging one by one as the sky darkened. This was it. This was what all of it was for. The long hours at the docks, the careful saving, the years of work and worry. For moments like this when the world slowed down and you could actually feel yourself living in it. The brass band played on, waltzes and polkas and popular songs that everyone knew. The same kind of music that filled the music halls, the same kind of music that aristocrats danced to in their ballrooms, just played here on a summer night for anyone who wanted to listen. Entertainment, that thread that ran through everything we've talked about tonight, from Billy's first nights at the pub, singing along to songs he barely knew, through Charlie's penny gaff, that rickety theatre where factory boys cheered for outlaws, through the music halls and their magnificent chaos, through drawing, rooms where respectable people played charades and pretended not to be bored, through croquet lawns and seaside holidays and all the small rebellions against routine, through fox hunts and shooting parties and balls that lasted until dawn, through gentlemen's clubs and royal race meetings and all the elaborate rituals of the wealthy. All of it, all those different lives in all those different worlds united by the same simple need, something to do, someone to do it with, a reason to keep going. The Victorian age was ending, though. Nobody on that beach in 1881 knew it yet. 20 years left, 20 years of change. That would transform everything. Cinema would arrive. Moving pictures, that made the penny gaffs look primitive. Radio would come eventually, bringing music into homes without needing anyone to play it. The whole nature of entertainment would shift from something you went to into something that came to you. But that night on the promenade in Margate, none of that existed yet. There was just the brass band, the dancers, the waves, the stars, and people doing what people have always done, finding joy where they could, making memories that would last longer than the sandcastles. Billy and his wife walked back to their boarding house around 11. The streets were quieter now, the day's excitement settling into night's calm. Their children were still sleeping. James sprawled across the narrow bed, his little sister curled beside him, dreaming of donkeys and waves and sand. That tasted terrible but was fun to throw. Billy stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching them. These small people he'd made, this life he'd built, so different from his father's life, so full of possibilities that his father couldn't have imagined. His wife touched his arm. Time for bed. The Whitmore were already asleep in their hotel room. A nicer place than Billy could afford. Private bathroom, view of the sea, but the sleep was the same. That drift into darkness that claims everyone, eventually. Charlie Finch was awake a little longer, sitting by the window of his rented room, looking out at the lights of the town. His daughter slept behind him, exhausted from the day's adventures. He thought about that night at the Penny. Gaff all those years ago, Jack Shepherd escaping from prison over and over, the crowd cheering every impossible victory. He'd believed in those escapes as a boy, believed that the little guy could win, that rules were made to be broken, that life could be an adventure. He still believed some of that. The edges were softer now, worn down by years of learning how the world actually worked. But something remained, some small flame that the years hadn't managed to extinguish. His daughter stirred in her sleep, mumbled something about sandcastles. Charlie smiled, closed the curtain, went to bed. The town quieted. The brass band packed up their instruments. The last dancers wandered home. The waves kept coming as they always had, as they always would, and across England in cities and villages and country estates. Other people were finding their own endings to the day, their own small entertainments winding down, their own journeys towards sleep. This story began with the question of what people did for fun in times before, screens and speakers and all our modern machinery of entertainment. The answer turned out to be simpler than it might have seemed. They did what we do, found moments of joy in lives that were often hard, built connections with other people, laughed and sang and danced and played. The technology was different, the clothes were different, the rules were different, but the hearts were the same. And so we come to the end not just of this story, but of this day of yours. Whatever brought you here, whatever you were looking for when you pressed play or turned the page, you found this. A story about people who lived 150 years ago, who worried about things you'll never worry about, who dreamed dreams you'll never dream, but who also lay down at night just like you're lying down now, who felt the weight of the day lifting off their shoulders, who let their eyes close and their thoughts drift. The past isn't as far away as it seems. The people in it weren't so different from you. And sleep, that great equalizer, that entertainment everyone shares, was just as sweet for them as it is for you right now. Your pillow is soft. Your blanket is warm. The world outside can wait. Billy Harrison is sleeping. Charlie Finch is sleeping. The Whitmore are sleeping. Lord Arthur Peaton, in his grand house, far away, is sleeping. And soon you will be too. Let the waves of Margate wash through your mind, that gentle rhythm in and out, in and out. Let the music of the brass band fade into something softer, something quieter, something just for you. Let go of the day. Let go of tomorrow's worries. Let go of everything except this moment, this breath, this slow slide into rest. The Victorians knew how to entertain themselves, and now you know too. But the best entertainment of all is waiting for you now. Sleep well. Dream of nothing or everything or somewhere in between. The story will be here if you ever want to come back. The people in it aren't going anywhere. They've been waiting 150 years already. A little longer won't matter. Good night.